Part 2 of Part 6 of Trilby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.C. Guan. Trilby by Georges Dumouriez. Part 6, Part 2. They took the keys back to Madame Vinard in silence. She said, "Vous avez vu, n'est-ce pas, messieurs? Le pied de Trilby. C'est bien gentil, c'est monsieur Durien qui a fait mettre le verre quand vous êtes partis, et monsieur Guinaud qui a composé l'épitaphe. Pauvre Trilby, qu'est-ce qu'elle est devenue? Comme elle était bonne fille, hein? Et si belle! Et comme elle était vive, elle était vive, elle était vive! Et comme elle vous aimait tous bien, et surtout monsieur Litrobilly, n'est-ce pas?" Then she insisted on giving them each another liqueur glass of Turien's ratafia de Cassis, and took them to see her collection of bric-à-brac across the yard, a gorgeous show, and explained everything about it, how she had begun in quite a small way, but was making it a big business. "Voyez cette pendule, it is of the time of Louis XI, who gave it with his own hands to Madame de Pompadour. I bought it at a sale in—" "Combien?" said the laird. "150 francs, monsieur. C'est bien bon marché, une véritable occasion, et je prends," said the laird, meaning, "I take it." Then she showed them a beautiful brocade gown, which she had picked up a bargain at. "Combien?" said the laird. "Ah, ça c'est 300 francs, monsieur, mais je prends," said the laird. "Et voici les souliers qui vont avec, et que but here." Taffy took the laird by the arm and dragged him forth out of this too seductive sirenscape. The laird told her where to send his purchases, and with many expressions of love and goodwill on both sides, they tore themselves away from Monsieur and Madame Vinard. The laird, however, rushed back for a minute, and hurriedly whispered to Madame Vinard, "Oh, et le pied de Trilby, sur le mur, vous savez, avec le verre et tout le reste. Coupez le mur. Comprenez? Combien?" "Ah, monsieur," said Madame Vinard, "c'est un peu difficile, vous savez, couper un mur comme ça. On parlera au propriétaire si vous voulez, et ça pourrait peut-être s'arranger. Si c'est en bois, seulement il faut—" "Je prends," said the laird, and waved his hand in farewell. They went up the rue Vieille des Trois Mauvais Ladres, and found that about 20 yards of a high wall had been pulled down, just at the bend where the laird had seen the last of Trilby, as she turned round and kissed her hand to him, and they beheld within a quaint and ancient, long-neglected garden, a grey old garden, with tall, warty, black-boled trees, and damp, green, mossy paths that lost themselves under the brown and yellow leaves, and mould and muck, which had drifted into heaps here and there, the accumulation of years. A queer old faded pleasance, with wasted bowers, and dilapidated carved stone benches, and weather-beaten discoloured marble statues, noseless, armless, earless fauns and hamadryads. And at the end of it, in a tumble-down state of utter ruin, a still inhabited little house, with shabby blinds and window curtains, and broken window-panes mended with brown paper. A pavillon de fleurs that must have been quite beautiful 100 years ago. The once mysterious love-resort of long-buried abbés with light hearts and well-forgotten lords and ladies gay, red-heeled, patched, powdered, frivolous and shameless, but oh, how charming to the imagination of the 19th century. And right through the ragged lawn, where lay, upset in the long dewy grass, a broken doll's perambulator by a tattered polichinelle, went a desecrating track made by cart-wheels and horses' hoofs, and this, no doubt, was to be a new street. Perhaps, as Taffy suggested, la rue Neuve des Trois Mauvais Ladres, the new street of the three bad lepers. "Ah, Taffy," sententiously opined the laird, with his usual wink at little Billy, "I've no doubt the old lepers were the best, bad as they were." "I'm quite sure of it," said Taffy, with sad and sober conviction, and a long-drawn sigh. "I only wish I had a chance of painting one, just as he really was." How often they had speculated on what lay hidden behind that lofty old brick wall, and now this melancholy little peep into the once festive past, the touching sight of this odd old poverty-stricken abode of heaven knows what present grief and desolation, which a few strokes of the pickaxe had laid bare, seemed to chime in with their own grey mood that had been so bright and sunny an hour ago, and they went on their way quite dejectedly, for a stroll through the Luxembourg Gallery and Gardens. The same people seemed to be still copying the same pictures in the long, quiet, genial room so pleasantly smelling of oil paint. Rosa Bonheur's Labourage Nivernais, Herbert's Malaria, Couture's Decadent Romance. And in the formal dusty gardens were the same Pyoupius and Zuzus still walking with the same Nunus, or sitting by their sides on benches by formal ponds with gold and silver fish in them, and just the same old couples petting the same tutus and loulous. Then they thought they would go and lunch at Le Père Trince, the Restaurant de la Couronne, in the Rue du Luxembourg, for the sake of auld lang syne. But when they got there, the well-remembered fumes of that humble refectory, which had once seemed not unappetizing, turned their stomachs. So they contented themselves with warmly greeting Le Père, who was quite overjoyed to see them again, and anxious to turn the whole establishment topsy-turvy, that he might entertain such guests as they deserved. Then the laird suggested an omelette at the Café de l'Odéon, but Taffy said in his masterful way, "Damn the Café de l'Odéon!" and hailing a little open fly, they drove to Le Doyen's, or some such place, in the Champs-Élysées, where they feasted and became three prosperous Britons out for a holiday in Paris, three irresponsible musketeers, lords of themselves and Lutetia, beati posse gentis, and afterwards had themselves driven in an open carriage and pair through the Bois de Boulogne on the Fête de Saint-Cloud, or what still remains of it, for it lasts 6 weeks, the scenes of so many of Dodor's and Zuzu's exploits in past years, and found it more amusing than the Luxembourg Gardens. The lively and irrepressible spirit of Dodor seemed to pervade it still. But it doesn't want the presence of a Dodor to make the blue-bloused sons of the Gallic people, and its neatly shod, white-capped daughters, delightful to watch as they take their pleasure, and the laird, thinking perhaps of Hampstead Heath on an Easter Monday, must not be blamed for once more quoting his favourite phrase, the pretty little phrase with which the most humorous and least exemplary of British parsons began his famous journey to France. When they came back to the hotel to dress and dine, the laird found he wanted a pair of white gloves for the concert, une paire de gants blancs, as he called it, and they walked along the boulevards till they came to a haberdasher's shop of very good and prosperous appearance, and going in were received graciously by the patron, a portly little bourgeois, who waved them to a tall and aristocratic and very well-dressed young commis behind the counter, saying, "Une paire de gants blancs pour monsieur." And what was the surprise of our three friends in recognizing Dodor! The gay Dodor, Dodor l'irrésistible, quite unembarrassed by his position, was exuberant in his delight at seeing them again, and introduced them to the patron and his wife and daughter, Monsieur, Madame, and Mademoiselle Passefield. As it soon became pretty evident that in spite of his humble employment in that house, he was a great favourite in that family, and especially with Mademoiselle. Indeed, Monsieur Passefield invited our three heroes to stay and dine then and there, but they compromised matters by asking Dodor to come and dine with them at the hotel, and he accepted with alacrity. Thanks to Dodor, the dinner was a very lively one, and they soon forgot the regretful impression of the day. They learned that he hadn't got a penny in the world, and had left the army, and had for 2 years kept the books at Le Père Passofil's, and served his customers, and won his good opinion, and his wife's, and especially his daughter's, and that soon he was to be not only his employer's partner, but his son-in-law, and that, in spite of his impecuniosity, he had managed to impress them with the fact that in marrying a rigolo de la farce she was marrying a very splendid match indeed. His brother-in-law, the Honourable Jack Reeves, had long cut him for a bad lot, but his sister after a while had made up her mind that to marry Mademoiselle Passofil wasn't the worst he could do. At all events, it would keep him out of England, and that was a comfort. And passing through Paris, she had actually called on the Passofil family, and they had fallen prostrate before such splendour, and no wonder, for Mrs. Jack Reeve was one of the most beautiful, elegant, and fashionable women in London, the smartest of the smart. "And how about le Zouzou?" asked little Billy. "Ah, old Gontran, I don't see much of him. We no longer quite move in the same circles, you know. Not that he's proud, or me either, but he's a sub-lieutenant in the Guides, an officer. Besides, his brother's dead, and he's the Duc de la Rochemartel, and a special pet of the Empress. He makes her laugh more than anybody. He's looking out for the biggest heiress he can find, and he is pretty safe to catch her, with such a name as that. In fact, they say he's caught her already. Miss Lavinia Hunks of Chicago. $20 million, at least, so the Figaro says." Then he gave them news of other old friends, and they did not part till it was time for them to go to the Cirque des Bachibazouks, and after they had arranged to dine with his future family on the following day. In the Rue Saint-Honoré was a long double file of cabs and carriages slowly moving along to the portals of that huge hall, le Cirque des Bachibazouks. Is it there still, I wonder? I don't mind betting not. Just as this period of the Second Empire there was a mania for demolition and remolition, if there is such a word, I have no doubt my Parisian readers would search the Rue Saint-Honoré for the Salle des Bachibazouks in vain. Our friends were shown to their stalls, and looked round in surprise. This was before the days of the Albert Hall, and they had never been in such a big place of the kind before, or one so regal in aspect, so gorgeously imperial with white and gold and crimson velvet, so dazzling with light, so crammed with people from floor to roof, and cramming itself still. A platform carpeted with crimson cloth had been erected in front of the gates where the horses had once used to come in, and their fair riders, and the two jolly English clans, and the beautiful nobleman with the long frock-coat and brass buttons, and soft high boots, and four-in-hand whip, la chambrerie. In front of this was a lower stand for the orchestra. The circus itself was filled with stalls, stocks d'orchestre. A pair of crimson curtains hid the entrance to the platform at the back, and by each of these stood a small page ready to draw it aside and admit the diva. The entrance to the orchestra was by a small door under the platform, and some 30 or 40 chairs and music stands grouped around the conductor's estrade were waiting for the band. Little Billy looked round and recognized many countrymen and countrywomen of his own, many great musician celebrities especially, whom he had often met in London. Tiers upon tiers of people rose up all round in a widening circle, and lost themselves in a daisy mist of light at the top. It was like a picture by Martin. In the imperial box were the English ambassadors and his family, with an august British personage sitting in the middle, in front, his broad blue ribbon across his breast, and his opera-glass to his royal eyes. Little Billy had never felt so excited, so exhilarated by such a show before, nor so full of eager anticipation. He looked at his programme, and saw that the Hungarian band, the first that had yet appeared in Western Europe, I believe, would play an overture of gypsy dances. Then Madame Svengali would sing un air connu sans accompagnement, and afterwards other airs, including the Nussbaum of Schumann. For the first time in Paris, it seemed. Then the rest of 10 minutes, then more Czardas, then the diva would sing Malbrouck s'en va en guerre, of all things in the world, and finish up with un impromptu de Chopin sans parole. Truly a somewhat incongruous bill of fare. Close on the stroke of 9 the musicians came in and took their seats. They were dressed in the foreign hussar uniform that was now become so familiar. The first violin had scarcely sat down before our friends recognized in him their old friend Gecko. Just as the clock struck, Svengali, in irreproachable evening dress, tall and stout and quite splendid in appearance, notwithstanding his long black mane, which had been curled, took his place at his desk. Our friends would have known him at a glance, in spite of the wonderful alteration time and prosperity had wrought in his outward man. He bowed right and left to the thunderous applause that greeted him, gave his 3 little button-taps, and the lovely music began at once. We have grown accustomed to strains of this kind during the last 20 years, but they were new then, and their strange seduction was a surprise as well as an enchantment. Besides, no such band as Svengali's had ever been heard, and in listening to this overture the immense crowd almost forgot that was a mere preparation for the great musical event, and tried to encore it. But Svengali merely turned round and bowed. There were to be no encores that night. Then a moment of silence and breathless suspense. Curiosity on tiptoe. Then the 2 little page boys each drew a silken rope, and the curtains parted and looped themselves up on each side symmetrically, and a tall female figure appeared, clad in what seemed like a classical dress of cloth of gold, embroidered with garnets and beetles' wings, her snowy arms and shoulders bare, a gold coronet of stars on her head, her thick light brown hair tied behind and flowing all down her back to nearly her knees, like those ladies in hairdressers' shops who sit with their backs to the plate-glass window to advertise the merits of some particular hair-wash. She walked slowly down to the front, her hands hanging at her sides in quite a simple fashion, and made a slight inclination of her head and body towards the imperial box, and then to right and left. Her lips and cheeks were rouged, her dark level eyebrows nearly met at the bridge of her short high nose. Through her parted lips you could see her large glistening white teeth. Her grey eyes looked straight at Svengali. Her face was thin, and had a rather haggard expression, in spite of its artificial freshness, but its contour was divine, and its character so tender, so humble, so touchingly simple and sweet, that one melted at the sight of her. No such magnificent or seductive apparition has ever been seen before or since on any stage or platform, not even Miss Ellen Terry as the priestess of Artemis in the late laureate's play, The Cup. The house rose at her as she came down to the front, and she bowed again to right and left, and put her hand to her heart quite simply, and with a most winning natural gesture, an adorable gaucherie, like the graceful and unconscious schoolgirl, quite innocent of stage deportment. It was Trilby. Trilby the tone-deaf, who couldn't sing one single note in tune, Trilby, who couldn't tell a C from an F. What was going to happen? Our three friends were almost turned to stone in the immensity of their surprise. Yet the big taffy was trembling all over, the laird's jaw had all but fallen on to his chest. Little Billy was staring his eyes almost out of his head. There was something to them so strange and uncanny about it all, so oppressive, so anxious, so momentous. End of Part 2. Part 6. Recording by J.C. Guan, Montreal, June 2010. Part 3 of Part 6 of Trilby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.C. Guan. Trilby by Georges du Maurier. Part 6, Part 3. The applause had at last subsided. Trilby stood with her hands behind her, one foot, the left one, on a little stool that had been left there on purpose, her lips parted, her eyes on Svengali's, ready to begin. He gave his 3 beats, and the band struck a chord. Then, at another beat from him, but in her direction, she began, without the slightest appearance of effort, without any accompaniment whatever, he still beating time, conducting her, in fact, as if she had been an orchestra herself. Au clair de la lune, mon ami Pierrot, prête-moi ta plume pour écrire un mot. Ma chandelle est morte, je n'ai plus de feu. Ouvre-moi ta porte, pour l'amour de Dieu. This was the absurd old nursery rhyme with which La Svengali chose to make her debut before the most critical audience in the world. She sang it 3 times over, the same verse. There is but one. The first time she sang it without any expression whatever, not the slightest, just the words and the tune in the middle of her voice, and not loud at all, just as a child sings who is thinking of something else, or just as a young French mother sings who is darning socks by a cradle and rocking her baby to sleep with her foot. But her voice was so immense in its softness, richness, freshness, that it seemed to be pouring itself from all round, its intonation absolutely, mathematically pure. One felt it to be not only faultless, but infallible, and the seduction, the novelty of it, the strangely sympathetic quality. How can one describe the quality of a peach or a nectarine to those who have only known apples? Until La Svengali appeared, the world had only known apples, Catalanis, Jenny Linds, Chryses, Abonis, Pattis. The best apples that can be, for sure, but still only apples. If she had spread a pair of large white wings and gracefully fluttered up to the roof and perched upon the chandelier, she could not have produced a greater sensation. The like of that voice has never been heard, nor ever will be again. A woman archangel might sing like that, or some enchanted princess out of a fairy tale. Little Billy had already dropped his face into his hands and hid his eyes in his pocket handkerchief. A big tear had fallen onto Taffy's left whisker. The laird was trying hard to keep his tears back. She sang the verse a second time, with but little added expression, and no louder, but with a sort of breathy whitening of her voice that made it, like a broad heavenly smile of universal motherhood, turn into sound. One felt all the genial gaiety and grace of impishness of Pierrot and Columbine idealized into frolicsome beauty and holy innocence, as though they were performing for the saints in paradise, a baby Columbine with a cherub for clown. The dream of it all came over you for a second or two, a revelation of some impossible golden age, priceless, never to be forgotten. How on earth did she do it? Little Billy had lost all control over himself, and was shaking with his suppressed sobs. Little Billy, who hadn't shed a single tear for 5 long years. Half the people in the house were in tears, but tears of sheer delight, of delicate inner laughter. Then she came back to earth, and saddened and veiled and darkened her voice as she sang the verse for the 3rd time. And it was a great and sombre tragedy, too deep for any more tears, and somehow or other, poor Columbine, forlorn and betrayed and dying, out in the cold at midnight, sinking down to hell, perhaps, was making her last frantic appeal. It was no longer Pierrot and Columbine. It was Marguerite. It was Faust. It was the most terrible and pathetic of all possible human tragedies, but expressed with no dramatic or histrionic exaggeration of any sort, but mere tone, slight, subtle changes in the quality of the sound, too quick and elusive to be taken count of, but to be felt with. Oh, what poignant sympathy! When the song was over, the applause did not come immediately, and she waited with her kind, wide smile, as if she were well accustomed to wait like this. And then the storm began, and grew and spread and rattled and echoed, voice, hands, feet, sticks, umbrellas. And down came the bouquets, which the little page boys picked up, and Trilby bowed to front and right and left in her simple debonair fashion. It was her usual triumph. It had never failed, whatever the audience, whatever the country, whatever the song. Little Billy didn't applaud. He sat with his head in his hands, his shoulders still heaving. He believed himself to be fast asleep and in a dream, and was trying his utmost not to wake, for a great happiness was his. It was one of those nights to be marked with a white stone. As the first bars of the song came pouring out of her parted lips, whose shape he so well remembered, and her dove-like eyes looked straight over Svengali's head, straight in his own direction, nay, at him, something melted in his brain, and all his long-lost power of loving came back with a rush. It was like the sudden curing of a deafness that had been lasting for years. The doctor blows through your nose into your eustachian tube with a little india-rubber machine. Some obstacle gives way. There is a snap in your head, and straightway you hear better than you had ever heard in all your life, almost too well, and all your life is once more changed for you. At length he sat up again in the middle of Svengali's singing of the Nussbaum, and saw her, and saw the laird sitting by him, and Taffy, their eyes riveted on Trilby, and knew for certain that it was no dream this time, and his joy was almost a pain. She sang the Nussbaum, to its heavenly accompaniment, as simply as she had sung the previous song. Every separate note was a highly finished gem of sound, linked to the next by a magic bond. You did not require to be a lover of music to fall beneath the spell of such a voice as that. The mere melodic phrase had all but ceased to matter. Her phrasing, consummate as it was as simple as a child's. It was as if she said, "See, what does the composer count for? Here is about as beautiful a song as was ever written, with beautiful words to match, and the words have been made French for you by one of your smartest poets. But what do the words signify any more than the tune, or even the language? The Nussbaum is neither better nor worse than Mon Ami Pierrot, when I am the singer, for I am Svengali, and you shall hear nothing, see nothing, think of nothing but Svengali, Svengali, Svengali. It was the apotheosis of voice and virtuosity. It was il bel canto, come back to earth after 100 years, the bel canto of Vivarelli, let us say, who sang the same song every night to the same king of Spain for a quarter of a century, and was rewarded with a dukedom and wealth beyond the dreams of avarice. And indeed, here was this immense audience, made up of the most cynically critical people in the world, and the most anti-German, assisting with rapt ears and streaming eyes at the imagined spectacle of a simple German damsel, a Mädchen, a Fraulein, just Verlobte, a future Hausfrau, sitting under a walnut tree in some suburban garden, a Berlin around her. Her family and her friends probably drinking beer and smoking long porcelain pipes and talking politics or business and cracking innocent, elaborate old German jokes with bated breath, lest they should disturb her maiden dream of love. And all as though it were a scene in Elysium, and the Fraulein a nymph of many-fountained Ida, and her people Olympian gods and goddesses. And such indeed they were when Trilby sang of them. After this, when the long frantic applause had subsided, she made a gracious bow to the Royal British Opera glass, which had never left her face, and sang Ben Bolt in English. And then little Billy remembered there was such a person as Svengali in the world, and recalled his little flexible flageolet. That is how I teach Gecko. That is how I teach La Petite Honorine. That is how I teach Il Bel Canto. It was lost, Il Bel Canto, and I found it in a dream. I, Svengali. And his old cosmic vision of the beauty and sadness of things, the very heart of them, and their pathetic evanescence, came back with a tenfold clearness, that heavenly glimpse beyond the veil, and with it a crushing sense of his own infinitesimal significance by the side of the glorious pair of artists, one of whom had been his friend and the other his love, a love who had offered to be his humble mistress and slave, not feeling herself good enough to be his wife. It made him sick and faint to remember, and filled him with hot shame, and then and there his love for Trilby became as that of a dog for its master. She sang once more Chanson de Printemps by Gounod, who was present and seemed very hysterical, and the first part of the concert was over, and people had time to draw breath and talk over this new wonder, this revelation of what the human voice could achieve, and an immense hum filled the hall, astonishment, enthusiasm, ecstatic delight. But our three friends found little to say, for what they felt there were as yet no words. Taffy and the Laird looked at little Billy, who seemed to be looking inward at some transcendent dream of his own, with red eyes, and his face all pale and drawn, and his nose very pink and rather thicker than usual, and the dream appeared to be out of the common, blissful, though his eyes were swimming still. For his smile was almost idiotic in its rapture. The second part of the concert was still shorter than the first, and created, if possible, a wilder enthusiasm. Trilby only sang twice. Her first song was Malbrook s'en va en guerre. She began it quite lightly and merrily, like a jolly march, in the middle of her voice, which had never as yet revealed any exceptional compass or range. People laughed quite frankly at the first verse. Malbrook s'en va en guerre, mironton, mironton, mirontaine. Malbrook s'en va en guerre, ne sait qu'on reviendra, ne sait qu'on reviendra, ne sait qu'on reviendra. The mironton mirontaine was the very essence of high martial resolve and heroic self-confidence. One would have left a forlorn hope after hearing it once. Il reviendra à Pâques, mironton, mironton, mirontaine. Il reviendra à Pâques ou à la Trinité. People still laughed, though the mironton mirontaine betrayed an uncomfortable sense of the dawning of doubts and fears, vague forebodings. La Trinité se passe, mironton, mironton, mirontaine. La Trinité se passe, Marbouc ne revient pas. And there, especially in the mironton mirontaine, a note of anxiety revealed itself, so poignant, so acutely natural and human, that it became a personal anxiety of one's own, causing the heart to beat, and one's breath was short. Madame à sa tour remonte, mironton, mironton, mirontaine. Madame à sa tour remonte, si haut qu'elle peut monter. Oh, how one's heart went with her! Anne, Sister Anne, do you see anything? Elle voit de loin son page, mironton, mironton, mirontaine. Elle voit de loin son page, tout de noir habillé. One is almost sick with the sense of impending calamity. It is all but unbearable. Mon page, mon beau page, mironton, mironton, mirontaine. Mon page, mon beau page, quelle nouvelle apporter. And here little Billy begins to weep again, and so does everybody else. The mironton mirontaine is an agonized wail of suspense. Poor bereaved Duchess, poor Sarah Jennings, did it all announce itself to you just like that? All this while the accompaniment had been quite simple, just a few obvious ordinary chords. But now, quite suddenly, without a single modulation or note of warning, down goes the tune, a full major third from E to C, into the graver depths of Trilby's great contralto, so solemn and ominous that there is no more weeping, but the flesh creeps, the accompaniment slows and elaborates itself, the march becomes a funeral march, with muted strings, and quite slowly. Aux nouvelles que j'apporte, mironton, mironton, mirontaine. Aux nouvelles que j'apporte, vos beaux yeux vont pleurer. Richer and richer grows the accompaniment. The mironton mirontaine becomes a dirge. Quittez vos habits roses, mironton, mironton, mirontaine. Quittez vos habits roses et vos satins brochés. Here the ding-donging of a big bell seems to mingle with the score, and very slowly, so impressively that the news will ring for ever in the ears and hearts of those who hear it from La Svengali's lips. Le sieur Malbrook est mort, mironton, mironton, mirontaine. Le sieur Malbrook est mort et enterré. And thus it ends quite abruptly. And this heart-rending tragedy, this great historical epic in 24 lines, at which some 5,000 or 6,000 gay French people are sniffling and mopping their eyes like so many Niobes, is just a common old French comic song, a mere nursery ditty, like Little Bo Peep, to the tune "We won't go home till morning, till daylight doth appear." And after a second or two of silence, oppressive and impressive as that which occurs at a burial where the handful of earth is being dropped on the coffin lid, the audience bursts once more into madness, and La Svengali, who accepts no encores, has to bow for nearly 5 minutes, standing amid a sea of flowers. Then comes her great and final performance. The orchestra swiftly plays the first 4 bars of the bass in Chopin's impromptu A flat, and suddenly, without words, as a light nymph catching the whirl of a double-skipping rope, La Svengali breaks in and vocalizes that astounding piece of music that so few pianists can even play, but no pianist has ever played it like this, no piano has ever given out such notes as these. Every single phrase is a string of perfect gems, of purest ray serene, strung together on a loose golden thread. The higher and shriller she sings, the sweeter it is, higher and shriller than any woman had ever sung before. End of Part 3, Part 6. Recording by J.C. Guan, Montreal, July 2010.
Part 4 of Part 6 of Trilby. This is LibriVox Recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jersey City Frankie. Trilby by George de Maurier. Part 6, Part 4. Waves of sweet and tender laughter, the very heart and essence of innocent, high-spirited girlhood, alive to all that is simple and joyous and elementary in nature. The freshness of the morning, the ripple of the stream, the click of the mill, the lisp of the wind in the trees, the song of the lark in the cloudless sky, the sun and the dew, the scent of early flowers in summer woods and meadows, the sight of birds and bees and butterflies and frolicsome young animals at play, all the sights and scents and sounds that are the birthright of happy children, happy savages in favored climes, things within the remembrance and the reach of most of us, all this, the memory and the feel of it, are in Trilby's voice as she warbles that long, smooth, lilting, dancing laugh, that shower of linked sweetness, that wondrous song without words, and those who hear it feel it all, and remember it with her. It is irresistible. It forces itself on you. No words, no pictures could ever do the like. So that the tears that are shed out of all these many French eyes are tears of pure, unmixed delight in happy reminiscence. Chopin, it is true, may have meant something quite different. A hothouse, perhaps, with orchids and arum lilies and tuberoses and hydrangeas, but all this is neither here nor there, as the laird would say in French. Then comes the slow movement, the sudden adagio, with its capricious ornaments, the waking of the virgin heart, the stirring of the sap, the dawn of love, its doubts and fears and questionings, and the mellow, powerful, deep-chest notes are like the pealing of great golden bells, with a light little pearl shower tinkling round drops from the upper fringes of her grand voice as she shakes it. Then back again, the quick part, childhood once more, da capo, only quicker, hurry, hurry, but distinct as ever, loud and shrill and sweet beyond compare, drowning the orchestra, of a piercing quality quite ineffable, a joy there is no telling, a clear, purling, crystal stream that gurgles and foams and bubbles along over sunlit stones, a wonder, a world's delight, and there is not a sign of effort, of difficulty overcome. All through, Trilby smiles her broad angelic smile, her lips well parted, her big white teeth glistening as she gently jerks her head from side to side in time to Svengali's baton, as if to shake the willing notes out quicker and higher and shriller. And in a minute or two it is all over, like the lovely bouquet of fireworks at the end of the show, and she lets what remains of it the out and away like the afterglow of fading Bengal fires. Her voice receding into the distance, coming back to you like an echo from all round, from anywhere you please, quite soft, hardly more than a breath, but such a breath. Then one last chromatically ascending rocket, pianissimo, up to E and alt, and then darkness and silence. And after a little pause, the many-headed rises as one and waves its hats and sticks and handkerchiefs, and stamps and shouts, "Vive la Svengali! Vive la Svengali!" Svengali steps onto the platform by his wife's side and kisses her hand, and they both bow themselves backward through the curtains, which fall to rise again and again on this astounding pair. Such was La Svengali's debut in Paris. It had lasted little over an hour, 1/4 of which at least had been spent in plaudits and courtesies. The writer is no musician, alas, as no doubt his musical readers have found out by this, save in his thraldom to music of not too severe a kind, and laments the clumsiness and inadequacy of this wild, though somewhat ambitious, attempt to recall an impression received more than 30 years ago, to revive the ever-blessed memory of that unforgettable first night at the Cirque de Bechebezouks. Would that I could transcribe here Berlioz's famous series of 12 articles, entitled Le Svengali, which were republished from L'Hilaire et Léon, and are now out of print. Or Théophile Gautier's elaborate rhapsody, Madame Svengali, Ung aux Femmes, in which he proves that one need not have a musical ear, he hadn't, to be enslaved by such a voice as hers, and more than the eye for beauty, this he had, to fall the victim of her celestial form and face. It is enough, he says, to be simply human. I forget in which journal this eloquent tribute appeared. It is not to be found in his collected works. Or the intemperate diatribe by Herr Blengner, as I will christen him, on the tyranny of the prima donna called Svengalismus, in which he attempts to show that mere virtuosity carried to such a pitch is mere vitiosity, base acrobatismus of the vocal cords, a hysteric appeal to morbid Gaelic sentimentalismus, and that this monstrous development of a phenomenal larynx, this degrading cultivation and practice of the abnormalismus of a mere physical peculiarity, are death and destruction to all true music, since they place Mozart and Beethoven, and even himself, on a level with Bellini, Donizetti, Offenbach, any Italian tune-tinkler and ballad-monger of the hated Paris pavement, and can make the highest music of all, even his own, go down with the common French herd at the very first hearing, just as if it were some idiotic refrain of the Café Chantant. So much for Blagnerismus versus Svengalismus. But I fear there is no space within the limits of this humble tale for these masterpieces of technical musical criticism. Besides, there are other reasons. Our three heroes walked back to the boulevards, the only silent ones amid the throng that poured through the Rue Saint-Honoré, and the Cirque de Bechebezouks emptied itself of its overexcited audience. They went arm in arm, as usual, but this time little Billy was in the middle. He wished to feel on each side of him the warm and genial contact of his two beloved old friends. It seemed as if they had suddenly been restored to him after 5 long years of separation. His heart was overflowing with affection for them, too full to speak just yet. Overflowing indeed with the love of life, the love of death, the love of all that is and ever was and ever will be, just as in his old way. He could have hugged them both in the open street, before the whole world, and the delight of it was that this was no dream, about that there was no mistake. He was himself again at last, after 5 years, and wide awake, and he owed it all to Trilby. And what did he feel for Trilby? He couldn't tell yet. It was too vast as yet to be measured, and at last it was weighed with such a burden of sorrow and regret that he might well put off the thought of it a little while longer, and gather in what bliss he might. Like the man whose hearing has been restored after long years, he would revel in the mere physical delight of hearing for a space, and not go out of his way as yet to listen for the bad news that was already in the air and would come to roost quite soon enough. Taffy and the laird were silent also. Trilby's voice was still in their ears and hearts, her image in their eyes, and utter bewilderment still oppressed them and kept them dumb. It was a warm and balmy night, almost like midsummer, and they stopped at the first café they met on the Boulevard de la Madeleine, comme autrefois, and ordered bocks of beer, and sat at a table on the pavement, the only one unoccupied, for the café was already crowded, the hum of lively talk was great, and La Svengali was in every mouth. The laird was the first to speak. He emptied his bock at a draught, and called for another, and lit a cigar, and said, "I don't believe it was Trilby after all. It was the first time her name had been mentioned between them that evening, and for 5 years." "Good heavens," said Taffy, "can you doubt it?" "Oh, yes, that was Trilby," said little Billy. Then the laird proceeded to explain that, putting aside the impossibility of Trilby's ever being taught to sing in tune, and her well-remembered loathing of Svengali, he had narrowly scanned her face through his opera-glass and found that, in spite of a likeness quite marvelous, there were well-marked differences. Her face was narrower and longer, her eyes larger, and their expression not the same. Then she seemed taller and stouter, and her shoulders broader and more drooping, and so forth. But the others wouldn't hear of it, and voted him cracked, and declared they even recognized the peculiar twang of her old speaking voice in the voice she now sang with, especially when she sang low down. And they all three fell to discussing the wonders of her performance like everybody else all around, little Billy leading, with an eloquence and a seeming of technical musical knowledge that quite impressed them, and made them feel happy and at ease, for they were anxious for his sake about the effect this sudden and so unexpected sight of her would have upon him after all that had passed. He seemed transcendently happy and elate, incomprehensibly so, in fact, and looked at them both with quite a new light in his eyes, as if all the music he had heard had trebled not only his joy in being alive, but his pleasure at being with them. Evidently he had quite outgrown his old passion for her, and that was a comfort indeed. But little Billy knew better. He knew that his old passion for her had all come back, and was so overwhelming and immense that he could not feel it just yet, nor yet the hideous pangs of a jealousy so consuming that it would burn up his life. He gave himself another 24 hours. But he had not to wait so long. He woke up after a short, uneasy sleep that very night to find that the flood was over him, and he realized how hopelessly, desperately, wickedly, insanely he loved this woman, who might have been his, but was now the wife of another man, a greater than he, and one to whom she owed it that she was more glorious than any other woman on earth, a queen among queens, a goddess. For what was any earthly throne compared to that she established in the hearts and souls of all who came within the sight and hearing of her? Beautiful as she was besides, beautiful, beautiful! And what must be her love for the man who had taught her and trained her and revealed her towering genius to herself and to the world, a man resplendent also, handsome and tall and commanding, a great artist from the crown of his head to the sole of his foot. And the remembrance of them, hand in hand, master and pupil, husband and wife, smiling and bowing in the face of all that splendid tumult they had called forth and could quell, stung and tortured and maddened him so that he could not lie still, but got up and raged and rampaged up and down his hot, narrow, stuffy bedroom, and longed for his old familiar brain disease to come back and narcotize his trouble, and be his friend and stay with him till he died. Where was he to fly for relief from such new memories as these, which would never cease, and the old memories, and all the glamour and grace of them that had been so suddenly called out of the grave? And how could he escape, now that he felt the sight of her face and the sound of her voice would be a craving, a daily want, like that of some poor starving outcast for warmth and meat and drink? And little innocent, pathetic, ineffable, well-remembered sweetness of her changing face kept painting themselves on his retina, and incomparable tones of this new thing, her voice, her infinite voice, went ringing in his head till he all but shrieked aloud in his agony. And then that poisoned and delirious sweetness of those mad kisses, by hopeless fancy feigned on lips that are for others. And then the gruesome physical jealousy, that miserable inheritance of all artistic sons of Adam, that plague and torment of the dramatic, plastic imagination, which can idealize so well, and yet realize, alas, so keenly. After 3 or 4 hours spent like this, he could stand it no longer. Madness was lying his way, so he hurried on a garment, and went and knocked at Taffy's door. "Good God, what's the matter with you?" explained the good Taffy, as little Billy tumbled into his room, calling out, "Oh, Taffy, Taffy, I've gone mad, I think." And then, shivering all over and stammering incoherently, he tried to tell his friend what was the matter with him with great simplicity. Taffy, in much alarm, slipped down his trousers and made little Billy get into his bed, and sat by his side holding his hand. He was greatly perplexed, fearing the recurrence of another attack like that of 5 years back. He didn't dare leave him for an instant to wake the laird and send for a doctor. Suddenly, little Billy buried his face in the pillow and began to sob, and some instinct told Taffy this was the best thing that could happen. The boy had always been a highly strung, emotional, overexcitable, oversensitive, and quite uncontrolled Mammy's darling. A crybaby sort of chap who had never been to school. It was all a part of his genius, and also a part of his charm. It would do him good once more to have a good blub after 5 years. After a while, little Billy grew quieter, and then suddenly he said, "What a miserable ass you must think me. What an unmanly duffer." "Why, my friend?" "Why, for going on in this idiotic way. I really couldn't help it. I went mad, I tell you. I've been walking up and down my room all night till everything seemed to go round." "So have I." "You? What for?" "The very same reason." "What?" "I was just as fond of Trilby as you were, only she happened to prefer you." "What?" cried little Billy again. "You were fond of Trilby?" "I believe you, my boy." "In love with her?" "I believe you, my boy." "She never knew it, then?" "Oh, yes, she did." "She never told me, then?" "Didn't she? That's like her. I told her, at all events. I asked her to marry me." "Well, I am damned. When?" "That day we took her to Moudon with Junot, and dined at the Gare de Chantetre, and she danced the can-can with Sandy." "Well, I am... And she refused you?" "Apparently so." "Well, why on earth did she refuse you?" "I suppose she'd already begun to fancy you, my friend. Il y en a toujours un autre." "Fancy me? Prefer me? To you?" "Well, yes, it does seem odd, old fellow? But there's no accounting for taste, you know. She's built on such an ample scale herself, I suppose, that she likes little uns contrastes, you see. She's very maternal, I think. Besides, you're a smart little chap, and you ain't half bad. And you've got brains and talent and lots of cheek, and all that. I'm rather a ponderous kind of party." "Well, I'm damned." "C'est comme ça. I took it lying down, you see." "Does the laird know?" "No, and I don't want him to, nor anybody else." "Taffy, what a regular downright old trump you are." "Glad you think so. Anyhow, we're both in the same boat, and we've got to make the best of it. She's another man's wife, and probably she's very fond of him. I'm sure she ought to be, cad as he is, after all he's done for her, so there's an end of it." "Ah, there'll never be an end of it for me. Never, never. Oh, never. My God, she would have married me but for my mother's meddling. And that stupid old ass, my uncle. What a wife. Think of all she must have in her heart and brain, only to sing like that. And, oh, Lord, how beautiful she is. A goddess. Oh, the brow and the cheek and the chin. And the way her head's put on. Did you ever see anything like it? Oh, if only I hadn't written and told my mother I was going to marry her, why, we should have been man and wife for 5 years by this time, living at Barbizon, painting away like mad. Oh, what a heavenly life. Oh, curse all officious meddling with other people's affairs. Oh! There you go again. What's the good? And where do I come in, my friend? I should have been no better off, old fellow, worse than ever, I think." Then there was a long silence. At length little Billy said, "Taffy, I can't tell you what a trump you are. All I've ever thought of you, and God knows that's enough, will be nothing to what I shall always think of you after this." "All right, old chap." "And now I think I'm all right again, for a time, and I shall cut back to bed. Good night. Thanks more than I can ever express." And little Billy, restored to his balance, cut back to his own bed just as the day was breaking. End of Part 6th.
Part 1 of Part 7th of Trilby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Estelle Jobson. Trilby by George de MAURIER. Part 7th, Part 1. The moon made thy lips pale, beloved. The wind made thy bosom chill. The night did shed on thy dear head its frozen dew, and thou didst lie with the bitter breath of the naked sky might visit thee at will. Next morning our three friends lay late abed, and breakfasted in their rooms. They had all three passed white nights, even the laird, who had tossed about and pressed a sleepless pillow till dawn, so excited had he been by the wonder of Trilby's reincarnation, so perplexed by his own doubts as to whether it was really Trilby or not. And certain haunting tones of her voice, that voice so cruelly sweet, which clove the stillness with a clang so utterly new, so strangely heart-piercing and seductive that the desire to hear it once more became nostalgic, almost an ache, certain bits and bars and phrases of the music she had sung, unspeakable felicities and facilities of execution, sudden exotic warmths, fragrances, tendernesses, graces, depths and breadths, quick changes from grave to gay, from rough to smooth, from great metallic brazen clangors to soft golden suavities, all the varied modes of sound we try so vainly to borrow from vocal nature by means of wind and reed and string. All this new Trilbiness kept echoing in his brain all night, for he was of a nature deeply musical, and sleep had been impossible to him. As when we dwell upon a word we know, repeating till the word we know so well becomes a wonder, and we know not why, so dwelt the laird upon the poor old tune Ben Bolt, which kept singing itself over and over again in his tired consciousness, and maddened him with novel, strange, unhackneyed, unsuspected beauties, such as he had never dreamed of in any earthly music. It had become a wonder, and he knew not why. They spent what was left of the morning at the Louvre, and tried to interest themselves in the marriage of Cana, and the woman at the well, and Van Dyck's man with the glove, and the little princess of Velasquez, and Lisa Gioconda's smile. It was of no use trying. There was no sight worth looking at in all Paris but Trilby, in her gold raiment, no other princess in the world, no smile but hers, when through her parted lips came bubbling Chopin's impromptu. They had not long to stay in Paris, and they must drink of that bubbling fountain once more, coûte que coûte. They went to the Salle des Bajibazouks, and found that all seats all over the house had been taken for days and weeks, and the queue at the door had already begun, and they had to give up all hopes of slaking this particular thirst. Then they went and lunched perfunctorily, and talked desultorily over lunch, and read criticisms of La Svengali's debut in the morning papers, a chorus of journalistic acclamation gone mad, a frenzied eulogy in every key. But nothing was good enough for them. Brand new words were wanted, another language. Then they wanted a long walk, and could think of nowhere to go in all Paris, that immense Paris, where they had promised themselves to see so much that the week they were to spend there had seemed too short. Looking in a paper, they saw it announced that the band of the Imperial Guides would play that afternoon in the Pré Catalan, Bois de Boulogne, and thought they might as well walk there as anywhere else, and walk back again in time to dine with the passe-filles. A prandial function which did not promise to be very amusing, but still it was something to kill the evening with, since they couldn't go and hear Trilby again. Outside the Pré Catalan they found a crowd of cabs and carriages, saddle horses and grooms. One might have thought oneself in the height of the Paris season. They went in and strolled about here and there, and listened to the band, which was famous. It has performed in London at the Crystal Palace, and they looked about and studied life, or tried to. Suddenly they saw, sitting with three ladies, one of whom, the eldest, was in black, a very smart young officer, a guide, all red and green and gold, and recognized their old friend Zuzu. They bowed, and he knew them at once, and jumped up and came to them and greeted them warmly, especially his old friend Taffy, whom he took to his mother, the lady in black, and introduced to the other ladies, the younger of whom, strangely unlike the rest of her countrywomen, was so lamentably, so pathetically plain, that it would be brutal to attempt the cheap and easy task of describing her. It was Miss Lavinia Hunks, the famous American millionairess, and her mother. Then the good Zuzu came back and talked to the laird and little Billy. Zuzu, in some subtle and indescribable way, had become very ducal indeed. He looked extremely distinguished for one thing in his beautiful guide's uniform, and was most gracefully and winningly polite. He inquired warmly after Mrs. and Miss Bagot, and begged little Billy would recall him to their amiable remembrance when he saw them again. He expressed most sympathetically his delight to see little Billy looking so strong and so well. Little Billy looked like a pallid little washed-out ghost after his white night. They talked of Dodo. He said how attached he was to Dodo, and always should be, but Dodo, it seemed, had made a great mistake in leaving the army and going into a retail business, petit commerce. He had done for himself, de gringole. He should have stuck to the dragon. With a little patience and good conduct, he would have won his epaulettes, and then one might have arranged for him a good little marriage, un parti convenable. For he was très joli garçon, Dodo, bonne tournure, et très gentiment né. C'est très ancien les rigolos, dans le Poitou, je crois, la farce, et tout ça, tout à fait bien. It was difficult to realize that this polished and discreet and somewhat patronizing young man of the world was the jolly dog who had gone after little Billy's hat on all fours in the Rue Vieille des Trois Mauvais Ladres, and brought it back in his mouth, the caryatide. Little Billy knew that Monsieur le Duc de la Rochemar-tel Boisségur had quite recently delighted a very small and select and most august imperial supper party at Compiègne with this very story, not blinking a single detail of his own share in it, and he had given a most touching and sympathetic description of le joli petit peintre anglais qui s'appelait Litre Billy et ne pouvait pas se tenir sur ses jambes, et qui pleurait d'amour fraternel dans les bras de mon copain Dodor. Ah, Monsieur Gontran, ce que je donnerais pour avoir vu ça, had said the greatest lady in France. Un de mes zouaves à quatre pattes dans la rue, un chapeau dans la bouche, oh, c'est impayable. Zuzu kept these blackguard bohemian reminiscences for the imperial circle alone, to which it was suspected that he was secretly rallying himself. Among all outsiders, especially within the narrow precincts of the cream of the noble faubourg, which remained aloof from the Tuileries, he was a very proper and gentlemanlike person indeed, as his brother had been, and in his mother's fond belief, très bien pensant, très bien vu, à Frosdorf et à Rome. On lui aurait donné le bon Dieu sans confession, as Madame Vinard had said of little Billy. They would have shriven him at sight, and admitted him to the Holy Communion on trust. He did not present little Billy and the lad to his mother, nor to Mrs. and Miss Hunks. That honour was reserved for the man of blood alone. Nor did he ask where they were staying, nor invite them to call on him. But in parting he expressed the immense pleasure it had given him to meet them again, and the hope he had of some day shaking their hands in London. As the friends walked back to Paris together, it transpired that the man of blood had been invited by Madame Duchesse Mère, Maman Duchesse, as Zuzu called her, to dine with her next day, and meet the Hunkses at a furnished apartment she had taken in the Place Vendôme. For they had let, to the Hunkses, the Hôtel de la Roche-Martel in the Rue de Lille. They had also been obliged to let their place in the country, le Château des Boisségur, to Monsieur d'Espoir, or Despoir, as he chose to spell himself on his visiting cards, the famous soap manufacturer, un très brave homme, à ce qu'on dit, and whose only son, by the way, soon after married Mademoiselle Jeanne Adelaide d'Amory-Brissac de Roncevaux de Boisségur de la Roche-Martel. Il ne fait pas gras chez nous à présent, je vous assure, Madame Duchesse Mère had pathetically said to Taffy, but had given him to understand that things would be very much better for his son in the event of his marriage with Miss Hunks. Good heavens, said little Billy on hearing this. That grotesque little bogey in blue, why, she's deformed, she squints, she's a dwarf and looks like an idiot. Millions or no millions, the man who marries her is a felon. As long as there are stones to break and a road to break them on, the able-bodied man who marries a woman like that for anything but pity and kindness, and even then dishonors himself, insults his ancestry, and inflicts on his descendants a wrong that nothing will ever redeem. He nips them in the bud, he blasts them forever. He ought to be cut by his fellowmen, sent to Coventry, to jail, to penal servitude for life. He ought to have a separate hell to himself when he dies. He ought to— Shut up, you little blaspheming ruffian, said the laird. Where do you expect to go to yourself with such frightful sentiments? And what would become of your beautiful old 12th century dukedoms, with 100 yards of back frontage opposite the Louvre, on a beautiful historic river, and a dozen beautiful historic names, and no money if you had your way? And the laird wunk his historic wink. 12th century dukedoms be damned, said Tuffy, au grand sérieux, as usual. Little Billy's quite right, and Zuzu makes me sick. Besides, what does she marry him for? Not for his beauty either, I guess. She's his fellow criminal, his deliberate accomplice, particeps delicti, accessory before the act and after. She has no right to marry at all. Tar and feathers and a rail for both of them, and for Maman Duchesse too. And I suppose that's why I refused her invitation to dinner. And now let's go and dine with Dodor. Anyhow, Dodor's young woman doesn't marry him for a dukedom, or even his deux, mais bien pour ses beaux yeux. And if the rigolos of the future turn out less nice to look at than their sire, and not quite so amusing, there will probably be a great improvement on him in many other ways. There's room enough, and to spare. "Hear, hear," said little Billy, who always grew flippant when Taffy got on his high horse. "Your health and song, sir, them's my sentiments to a T. What shall we have the pleasure of drinking after that very nice harmony?" After which they walked on in silence, each, no doubt, musing on the general contrariness of things, and imagining what splendid little Wynns, or Bagor, or McAllisters might have been ushered into a decadent world for its regeneration, if fate had so willed it that a certain magnificent and singularly gifted grisette, etc., etc., etc. Mrs. and Miss Hanks passed them as they walked along in their beautiful blue barouche with C-springs, un 8 ressort. Maman Duchesse passed them in a hired fly. Zuzu passed them on horseback. Tout Paris passed them. But they were none the wiser, and agreed that the show was not a patch on that in Hyde Park during the London season. When they reached the Place de la Concorde, it was that lovely hour of a fine autumn day in beautiful bright cities, when all the lamps are lit in the shops and streets and under the trees, and it is still daylight, a quick fleeting joy, and as a special treat on this particular occasion the sun set, and up rose the yellow moon over eastern Paris, and floated above the chimney-pots of the Tuileries. They stopped to gaze at the homeward procession of cabs and carriages, as they used to do in the old times. Tout Paris was still passing. Tout Paris is very long. They stood among a little crowd of sightseers like themselves, little Billy right in front, in the road. Presently a magnificent open carriage came by, more magnificent than even the Hunkses, with liveries and harness quite vulgarly resplendent, almost Napoleonic. Lolling back in it lay Monsieur et Madame Svengali, he with his broad-brimmed felt sombrero over his long black curls, wrapped in costly furs, smoking his big cigar of the Havana. By his side La Svengali, also in sables, with a large black velvet hat on, her light brown hair done up in a huge knot on the nape of her neck. She was rouged and pearl-powdered, and her eyes were blackened beneath, and thus made to look twice their size. But in spite of all such disfigurements, she was a most splendid vision, and caused quite a little sensation in the crowd as she came slowly by. Little Billy's heart was in his mouth. He caught Svengali's eye, and saw him speak to her. She turned her head and looked at him, standing there. They both did. Little Billy bowed. She stared at him with a cold stare of disdain, and cut him dead. So did Svengali. And as they passed he heard them both snigger, she with a little high-pitched, flippant snigger worthy of a London barmaid. Little Billy was utterly crushed, and everything seemed turning around. The laird and Taffy had seen it all without losing a detail. The Svengalis had not even looked their way. The laird said, "It's not Trilby, I swear. She could never have done that. It's not in her. And it's another face altogether, I'm sure of it." Taffy was also staggered and in doubt. They caught hold of little Billy, each by an arm, and walked him off to the boulevards. He was quite demoralized, and wanted not to dine at Passy. He wanted to go straight home at once. He longed for his mother as he used to long for her when he was in trouble as a small boy and she was away from home, longed for her desperately, to hug her and hold her and fondle her and be fondled for his own sake and hers. All his old love for her had come back in full, with what arrears! All his old love for his sister, for his old home. When they went back to the hotel to dress, for Dodo had begged them to put on their best evening war paint, so as to impress his future mother-in-law, little Billy became fractious and intractable, and it was only on Taffy's promising that he would go all the way to Devonshire with him on the morrow and stay with him there, that he could be got to dress and dine. The huge Taffy lived entirely by his affections, and he hadn't many to live by, the laird, Trilby, and little Billy. Trilby was unattainable, the laird was quite strong and independent enough to get on by himself, and Taffy had concentrated all his faculties of protection and affection on little Billy, and was equal to any burden or responsibility all this instinctive young fathering might involve. In the first place, little Billy had always been able to do it quite easily, and better than any one else in the world, the very things Taffy most longed to do himself and couldn't, and this inspired the good Taffy with a chronic reverence and wonder he could not have expressed in words. Then little Billy was physically small and weak, and incapable of self-control. Then he was generous, amiable, affectionate, transparent as crystal, without an atom of either egotism or conceit, and had a gift of amusing you and interesting you by his talk and its complete sincerity that never palled, and even his silence was charming. One felt so sure of him. There was hardly any sacrifice, little or big, that big Taffy was not ready and glad to make for little Billy. On the other hand, there lay deep down under Taffy's surface irascibility and earnestness about trifles, and beneath his harmless vanity of the strong man, a long-suffering patience, a real humility, a robustness of judgment, a sincerity and all-roundness, a completeness of sympathy, that made him very good to trust and safe to lean upon. Then his powerful and impressive aspect, his great stature, the gladiator-like poise of his small round head on his big neck and shoulders, his huge deltoids and deep chest and slender loins, his clean-cut ankles and wrists, all the long and bold and highly finished athletic shapes of him, that easy grace of strength that made all his movements a pleasure to watch, and any garment look well when he wore it, all this was a perpetual feast to the quick, prehensile, aesthetic eye. And then he had such a solemn, earnest, lovable way of bending pokers round his neck, and breaking them on his arm, and jumping his own height, or near it, and lifting up armchairs by one leg with one hand, and what not else. So that there was hardly any sacrifice, little or big, that little Billy would not accept from big Taffy as a mere matter of course, a fitting and proper tribute rendered by bodily strength to genius. Par nobile fratrum, well met and well mated for fast and long-enduring friendship. The family banquet at Monsieur Passefy's would have been dull but for the irrepressible Dodo, and still more for the Laird of Cockpen, who rose to the occasion and surpassed himself in geniality, drollery, and eccentricity of French grammar and accent. Monsieur Passefy was also a droll in his own way, and had the quickly familiar jocose facetiousness that seems to belong to the successful middle-aged bourgeois all over the world, when he's not pompous instead. He can even be both sometimes. Madame Passefy was not jocose. She was much impressed by the aristocratic splendor of Taffy, the romantic melancholy and refinement of little Billy, and their quiet and dignified politeness. She always spoke of Dodo as Monsieur de la Farce, though the rest of the family, and one or two friends who had been invited, always called him Monsieur Théodore, and he was officially known as Monsieur Rigolo. Whenever Madame Passefy addressed him or spoke of him in this aristocratic manner, which happened very often, Dodo would wink at his friends with his tongue in his cheek. It seemed to amuse him beyond measure. Mademoiselle Ernestine was evidently much too in love to say anything, and seldom took her eyes off Monsieur Théodore, whom she had never seen in evening dress before. It must be owned that he looked very nice, more ducal than even Zouzou, and to be Madame de la Farce en perspective, and the future owner of such a brilliant husband as Dodo was enough to turn a stronger little bourgeois head than Mademoiselle Ernestine's. She was not beautiful, but healthy, well grown, well brought up, and presumably of a sweet, kind, and amiable disposition, an ingénue fresh from her convent. Innocent as a child, no doubt, and it was felt that Dodo had done better for himself and for his race than Monsieur le Duc. Little Dodos need have no fear. End of Part 1, Part 7th. Recording by Estelle Jobson, Rome, Italy. Part 2 of Part 7th of Trilby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Estelle Jobson. Trilby by Georges de Maurier. Part 7th, Part 2. After dinner the ladies and gentlemen left the dining-room together and sat in a pretty salon overlooking the boulevard, where cigarettes were allowed, and there was music. Mademoiselle Ernestine laboriously played Les Cloches du Monastère by Monsieur Lefebvre Roelly, if I'm not mistaken. It's the most bourgeois piece of music I know. Then Dodo, with his sweet high voice, so strangely pathetic and true, sang goody-goody little French songs of innocence, of which he seemed to have an endless repertoire, to his future wife's conscientious accompaniment, to the immense delight also of all his future family, who were almost in tears, and to the great amusement of the laird, at whom he winked in the most pathetic parts, putting his forefinger to the side of his nose like Noah Claypole in Oliver Twist. The wonder of the hour, La Svengali, was discussed, of course. It was unavoidable. But our friends did not think it necessary to reveal that she was La Grande Trilby. That would soon transpire by itself. And indeed, before the month was a week older, the papers were full of nothing else. Madame Svengali, La Grande Trilby, was the only daughter of the Honourable and Reverend Sir Lord O'Ferrall. She had run away from the primeval forests and lonely marshes of Le Dublin to lead a free and easy life among the artists of the Quartier Latin of Paris, une vie de bohème. She was the Venus Anadyomene from top to toe. She was blanche comme neige, avec un volcan dans le cœur. Casts of her alabaster feet could be had at Bruciani's in the Rue de la Sorcière, Saint-Denis. He made a fortune. Monsieur Ingres had painted her left foot on the wall of a studio in the Place Saint-Anatole des Arts, and an eccentric Scotch milord, le Comte de Bangkok, had bought the house, containing the flat, containing the studio, containing the wall on which it was painted, had had the house pulled down, and the wall framed and glazed, and sent to his castle in Edinburgh. This unfortunately was in excess of the truth. It was found impossible to execute the laird's wish, on account of the material the wall was made of. So the Lord Count of Pangcock, such was Madame Vinard's version of Sandy's nickname, had to forego his purchase. Next morning our friends were in readiness to leave Paris. Even the laird had had enough of it, and longed to get back to his work again. A hara-kiri in Yokohama. He had never been to Japan, but no more had anyone else in those early days. They had just finished breakfast, and were sitting in the courtyard of the hotel, which was crowded, as usual. Little Billy went into the hotel post-office to dispatch a note to his mother. Sitting sideways there at a small table and reading letters was Svengali, of all people in the world. But for these two and a couple of clerks, the room was empty. Svengali looked up. They were quite close together. Little Billy, in his nervousness, began to shake, and half put out his hand, and drew it back again, seeing the look of hate on Svengali's face. Svengali jumped up, put his letters together, and passing by little Billy on his way to the door, called him verfluchter Schweinhund, and deliberately spat in his face. Little Billy was paralyzed for a second or two. Then he ran after Svengali and caught him just at the top of the marble stairs, and kicked him, and knocked off his hat and made him drop all his letters. Svengali turned around and struck him over the mouth and made it bleed, and little Billy hit out like a fury, but with no effect. He couldn't reach high enough, for Svengali was well over 6 feet. There was a crowd round them in a minute. including the beautiful old man in the court suit and gold chain, who called out, "Vite, vite, un commissaire de police!" a cry that was echoed all over the place. Taffy saw the row and shouted, "Bravo, little un!" and jumping up from his table, jostled his way through the crowd. And little Billy, bleeding and gasping and perspiring and stammering, said, He spat in my face, Taffy. Damn him! I'd never even spoken to him. Not a word, I swear." Svengali had not reckoned on Taffy's being there. He recognized him at once and turned white. Taffy, who had dogskin gloves on, put out his right hand and deftly seized Svengali's nose between his fore and middle fingers and nearly pulled it off, and swung his head 2 or 3 times backward and forward by it, and then from side to side, Svengali holding onto his wrist, and then, letting him go, gave him a sounding, open-handed smack on his right cheek. And a smack on the face from Taffy, even in play, was no joke, I'm told. It made one smell brimstone and see and hear things that didn't exist. Svengali gasped worse than little Billy and couldn't speak for a while. Then he said, "Lâche, grand lâche, que vous en ferez, mais de moins." "At your orders," said Taffy in beautiful French, and drew out his card case and gave him his card in quite the orthodox French manner, adding, "I shall be here till tomorrow at 12, but that is my London address, in case I don't hear from you before I leave. I'm sorry, but you really mustn't spit. You know it's not done. I will come to you whenever you send for me, even if I have to come from the end of the world." Très bien," said a military-looking old gentleman close by, who gave Taffy his card, in case he might be of any service, and who seemed quite delighted at the row. And indeed it was really pleasant to note with what smooth, flowing, rhythmical spontaneity the good Taffy could always improvise these swift little acts of summary retributive justice. No hurry or scurry or flurry whatever, not an inharmonious gesture, not an infelicitous line, the very poetry of violence, and almost its only excuse. Whatever it was worth, this was Taffy's special gift, and it never failed him at a pinch. When the commissaire de police arrived, all was over. Svengali had gone away in a cab, and Taffy put himself at the disposition of the commissaire. They went into the post office and discussed it all with the old military gentleman, and the major domo in velvet, and the 2 clerks who had seen the original insult. And all that was required of Taffy and his friends for the present was their names, prenames, titles, qualities, age, address, nationality, occupation, etc. "C'est une affaire qui s'arrangera autrement et autre part," had said the military gentleman, Monsieur le Général Comte de la Tour aux Loups. So it blew over quite simply, and all that day a fierce unholy joy burned in Taffy's choleric blue eye. Not, indeed, that he had any wish to injure Trilby's husband, or meant to do him any grievous bodily harm, whatever happened. But he was glad to have given Svengali a lesson in manners. That Svengali should injure him never entered into his calculations for a moment. Besides, he didn't believe Svengali would show fight, and in this he was not mistaken. But he had for hours the feel of that long, thick, shapely Hebrew nose being kneaded between his gloved knuckles, and a pleasing sense of the effectiveness of the tweak he had given it. So he went about chewing the cud of that heavenly remembrance all day, till reflection brought remorse, and he felt sorry, for he was really the mildest-mannered man that ever broke a head. Only the sight of little Billy's blood, which had been made to flow by such an unequal antagonist, had roused the old Adam. No message came from Svengali to ask for the names and addresses of Taffy's seconds, so Dodo and Zuzu, not to mention Mr. the General Count of the Tooralurals, as the laird called him, were left undisturbed. And our 3 musketeers went back to London clean of blood, whole of limb, and heartily sick of Paris. Little Billy stayed with his mother and sister in Devonshire till Christmas, Taffy staying at the village inn. It was Taffy who told Mrs. Bagor about La Svengali's all but certain identity with Trilby, after little Billy had gone to bed, tired and worn out, the night of their arrival. "Good heavens," said poor Mrs. Bagor. "Why, that's the new singing woman who's coming over here. There's an article about her in today's Times. It says she's a wonder, and that there's no one like her. Surely that can't be the Miss O'Ferrall I saw in Paris." It seems impossible, but I'm almost certain it is, and Willie has no doubts in the matter. On the other hand, McAllister declares it isn't. Oh, what trouble! So that's why poor Willie looks so ill and miserable. It's all come back again. Could she sing at all, then, when you knew her in Paris? Not a note. Her attempts at singing were quite grotesque. Is she still very beautiful? Oh, yes, there's no doubt about that, more than ever. And her singing, is that so very wonderful? I remember that she had a beautiful voice in speaking. Wonderful? Ah, yes, I never heard or dreamed the like of it. Grisi, Alboni, Patti, not one of them to be mentioned in the same breath. Good heavens! Why, she must be simply irresistible. I wonder you're not in love with her yourself. How dreadful these sirens are, wrecking the peace of families. You mustn't forget that she gave way at once at a word from you, Mrs. Bagot, and she was very fond of Willie. She wasn't a siren then. Oh, yes, that's true. She behaved very well. She did her duty. I can't deny that. You must try and forgive me, Mr. Wynne. Although I can't forgive her, that dreadful illness of poor Willie's, that bitter time in Paris. And Mrs. Bagot began to cry, and Taffy forgave. Oh, Mr. Wynne, let us still hope that there's some mistake, that it's only somebody like her. Why, she's coming to sing in London after Christmas. My poor boy's infatuation will only increase. What shall I do? Well, she's another man's wife, you see. So Willie's infatuation is bound to burn itself out as soon as he fully recognizes that important fact. Besides, she cut him dead in the Champs-Élysées, and her husband and Willie had a row next day at the hotel, and cuffed and kicked each other. That's rather a bar to any future intimacy, I think. Oh, Mr. Wynne, my son cuffing and kicking a man whose wife he's in love with? Good heavens! Oh, it was all right. The man had grossly insulted him, and Willie behaved like a brick, and got the best of it in the end, and nothing came of it. I saw it all. Oh, Mr. Wynne, and you didn't interfere? Oh, yes, I interfered, and everybody interfered. It was all right, I assure you. No bones were broken on either side, and there was no nonsense about calling out or swords or pistols and all that. Thank heaven! In a week or two little Billy grew more like himself again, and painted endless studies of rocks and cliffs and sea, and Taffy painted with him and was very content. The vicar and little Billy patched up their feud. The vicar also took an immense fancy to Taffy, whose cousin, Sir Oscar Wynne, he had known at college, and lost no opportunity of being hospitable and civil to him, and his daughter was away in Algiers. And all the nobility and gentry of the neighbourhood, including the poor dear Marquis, one of whose sons was in Taffy's old regiment, were civil and hospitable also to the two painters, and Taffy got as much sport as he wanted, and became immensely popular. And they had on the whole a very good time till Christmas, and a very pleasant Christmas, if not an exuberantly merry one. After Christmas, little Billy insisted on going back to London to paint a picture for the Royal Academy, and Taffy went with him, and there was dullness in the house of Bagot, and many misgivings in the maternal heart of its mistress. And people of all kinds, high and low, from the family at the court to the fishermen on the little pier and their wives and children, missed the two genial painters, who were the friends of everybody, and made such beautiful sketches of their beautiful coast. La Svengali has arrived in London. Her name is in every mouth. Her photograph is in the shop windows. She is to sing at Jay's monster concerts next week. She was to have sung sooner, but it seems some hitch has occurred, a quarrel between Monsieur Svengali and his first violin, who is a very important person. A crowd of people, as usual, only bigger, is assembled in front of the windows of the stereoscopic company in Regent Street, gazing at presentments of Madame Svengali in all sizes and costumes. She is very beautiful, there is no doubt of that, and the expression of her face is sweet and kind and sad, and of such a distinction that one feels an imperial crown would become her even better than her modest little coronet of gold stars. One of the photographs represents her in classical dress, with her left foot on a little stool, in something of the attitude of the Venus of Milo, except that her hands are clasped behind her back, and the foot is bare, but for a Greek sandal, and so smooth and delicate and charming, and with so rhythmical a set and curl of the 5 slender toes, the big one slightly tip-tilted and well apart from its longer and slighter and more aquiline neighbour. that this presentment of her sells quicker than all the rest. And a little man who, with two bigger men, has just forced his way in front, says to one of his friends, "Look, Sandy, look, the foot! Now have you got any doubts?" "Oh, yes, those are Trilby's toes, sure enough," says Sandy, and they all go in and purchase largely. As far as I have been able to discover, the row between Svengali and his first violin had occurred at a rehearsal in Drury Lane Theatre. Svengali, it seems, had never been quite the same since the 15th of October previous, and that was the day he had got his face slapped and his nose tweaked by Taffy in Paris. He had become short-tempered and irritable, especially with his wife, if she was his wife. Svengali, it seems, had reasons for passionately hating little Billy. He had not seen him for 5 years, not since the Christmas festivity in the Place Saint-Anatole, when they had sparred together after supper, and Svengali's nose had got in the way on this occasion and had been made to bleed. But that was not why he hated little Billy. When he caught sight of him standing on the curb in the Place de la Concorde and watching the procession of tout Paris, he knew him directly, and all his hate flared up. He cut him dead and made his wife do the same. Next morning he saw him again in the hotel post office, looking small and weak and flurried, and apparently alone, and being an Oriental, Israelite, Hebrew Jew, he had not been able to resist the temptation of spitting in his face, since he must not throttle him to death. The minute he had done this, he had regretted the folly of it. Little Billy had run after him and kicked and struck him, and he had returned the blow and drawn blood, and then, suddenly and quite unexpected, had come upon the scene that apparition so loathed and dreaded of old, the pig-headed Yorkshireman, the huge British Philistine, the irresponsible bull, the junker, the ex-Crimean Front de Boeuf, who had always reminded him of the brutal and contemptuous sword-clanking, spur-jingling aristocrats of his own country, ruffians that treated Jews like dogs. Callous as he was to the woes of others, the self-indulgent and highly strung musician was extra sensitive about himself, a very bundle of nerves, and especially sensitive to pain and rough usage, and by no means physically brave. The stern, choleric, invincible blue eye of the hated northern Gentile had cowed him at once, and that violent tweaking of his nose, that heavy, open-handed blow on his face, had so shaken and demoralized him that he had never recovered from it. He was thinking about it always, day and night, and constantly dreaming at night that he was being tweaked and slapped over again by a colossal nightmare Taffy, and waking up in agonies of terror, rage, and shame. All healthy sleep had forsaken him. Moreover, he was much older than he looked, nearly 50, and far from sound. His life had been a long, hard struggle. He had for his wife, slave, and pupil a fierce, jealous kind of affection that was a source of endless torment to him, for indelibly graven in her heart, which he wished to occupy alone, was the never-fading image of the little English painter, and of this she made no secret. Gecko no longer cared for the master. All Gecko's dog-like devotion was concentrated on the slave and pupil, whom he worshipped with a fierce but pure and unselfish passion. The only living soul that Svengali could trust was the old Jewess who lived with them, his relative, but even she had come to love the pupil as much as the master. On the occasion of this rehearsal at Drury Lane, he, Svengali, was conducting and Madame Svengali was singing. He interrupted her several times, angrily and most unjustly, and told her she was singing out of tune, like a verfluchte tomcat, which was quite untrue. She was singing beautifully, Home, Sweet Home. Finally he struck her 2 or 3 smart blows on her knuckles with his little baton, and she fell on her knees, weeping and crying out, "Oh, oh, Svengali, ne me battez pas, mon ami, je fais tout ce que je peux." On which little Gecko had suddenly jumped up and struck Svengali on the neck near the collarbone, and then it was seen that he had a little bloody knife in his hand, and blood flowed from Svengali's neck, and at the sight of it Svengali had fainted, and Madame Svengali had taken his head on her lap, looking dazed and stupefied, as in a waking dream. Gecko had been disarmed, but as Svengali recovered from his faint and was taken home, the police had not been sent for, and the affair was hushed up, and a public scandal avoided. But La Svengali's first appearance, to Monsieur J's despair, had to be put off for a week, for Svengali would not allow her to sing without him, nor indeed would he be parted from her for a minute, or trust her out of his sight. End of Part 2, Part 7th. Recording by Estelle Jobson, Rome, Italy. Part 3 of Part 7th of Trilby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Estelle Jobson. Trilby by George de Maurier. Part 7th, Part 3. The wound was a slight one. The doctor who attended Svengali described the wife as being quite imbecile, no doubt from grief and anxiety. But she never left her husband's bedside for a moment, and had the obedience and devotion of a dog. When the night came round for the postponed debut, Svengali was allowed by the doctor to go to the theatre, but he was absolutely forbidden to conduct. His grief and anxiety at this were uncontrollable. He raved like a madman, and Monsieur J was almost as bad. Monsieur J had been conducting the Svengali band at rehearsals during the week, in the absence of its master. An easy task. It had been so thoroughly drilled, and knew its business so well that it could almost conduct itself, and it had played all the music it had to play, much of which consisted of accompaniments to La Svengali's songs, many times before. Her repertoire was immense, and Svengali had written these orchestral scores with great care and felicity. On the famous night it was arranged that Svengali should sit in a box alone, exactly opposite his wife's place on the platform, where she could see him well, and a code of simple signals was arranged between him and Monsieur J, and the band, so that virtually he might conduct himself from his box should any hesitation or hitch occur. This arrangement was rehearsed the day before, a Sunday, and had turned out quite successfully, and La Svengali had sung in perfection in the empty theatre. When Monday evening arrived, everything seemed to be going smoothly. The house was soon crammed to suffocation, all but the middle box on the grand tier. It was not a promenade concert, and the pit was turned into guinea stalls. The promenade concerts were to begin a week later. Right in the middle of these stalls sat the laird and Taffy and little Billy. The band came in by degrees and tuned their instruments. Eyes were constantly being turned to the empty box, and people wondered what royal personages would appear. Monsieur J took his place amid immense applause and bowed in his inimitable way, looking often at the empty box. Then he tapped and waved his baton, and the band played its Hungarian dance music with immense success. When this was over there was a pause, and soon some signs of impatience from the gallery. Monsieur J had disappeared. Taffy stood up, his back to the orchestra, looking round. Someone came into the empty box and stood for a moment in front, gazing at the house. A tall man, deathly pale, with long black hair and a beard. It was Svengali. He caught sight of Taffy and met his eyes, and Taffy said, "Good God, look, look!" Then little Billy and the laird got up and looked, and Svengali for a moment glared at them, and the expression of his face was so terrible with wonder, rage, and fear that they were quite appalled. And then he sat down, still glaring at Taffy, the whites of his eyes showing at the top, and his teeth bared in a spasmodic grin of hate. Then thunders of applause filled the house, and turning round and seating themselves, Taffy and little Billy and the laird saw Trilby being led by J down the platform, between the players, to the front, her face smiling rather vacantly, her eyes anxiously intent on Svengali in his box. She made her bows to right and left, just as she had done in Paris. The band struck up the opening bars of Ben Bolt, with which she was announced to make her debut. She still stared, but she didn't sing, and they played the little symphony 3 times. One could hear Monsieur J in a hoarse, anxious whisper, saying, "Mais chantez donc, madame, pour l'amour de Dieu, commencez donc, commencez." She turned round with an extraordinary expression of face and said, "Chanter? Pourquoi donc voulez-vous que je chante, moi? Chantez quoi alors?" "Mais Ben Bolt, parbleu, chantez!" Ah, Benbolt, oui, je connais ça. Then the band began again, and she tried, but failed to begin herself. She turned round and said, Comment diable voulez-vous que je chante avec tout ce train qu'ils font, ces diables de musiciens? Mais mon Dieu, madame, qu'est-ce que vous avez donc? Cried Monsieur J. J'ai que j'aime mieux chanter sans toute cette satanée musique, parbleu. J'aime mieux chanter toute seule. Sans musique, alors. Mais chantez, chantez. The band was stopped. The house was in a state of indescribable wonder and suspense. She looked all round and down at herself, and fingered her dress. Then she looked up to the chandelier with a tender, sentimental smile, and began, Oh, don't you remember sweet Alice, Benbolt? Sweet Alice with hair so brown, who wept with delight when you gave her a smile. She had not got further than this when the whole house was in an uproar. Shouts from the gallery, shouts of laughter, hoots, hisses, catcalls, cockcrows. She stopped and glared like a brave lioness, and called out, Qu'est-ce que vous avez donc tous, tas de vieilles pommes cuites que vous êtes? Est-ce qu'on a peur de vous? And then suddenly, Why, you're all English, aren't you? What's all the row about? What have you brought me here for? What have I done, I should like to know? And in asking these questions, the depth and splendor of her voice was so extraordinary, its tone so pathetically feminine, yet so full of hurt and indignant command, that the tumult was stilled for a moment. It was the voice of some being from another world, some insulted daughter of a race more puissant and nobler than ours, a voice that seemed as if it could never utter a false note. Then came a voice from the gods in answer. Oh, you're English, are ye? Why don't you sing as you're bought to sing? You've got voice enough, anyhow. Why don't you sing in tune? Sing in tune, cried Trilby. I didn't want to sing at all. I only sang because I was asked to sing. That gentleman asked me, that French gentleman with the white waistcoat. I won't sing another note. Oh, you won't you? Then let us have our money back, or we'll know what for. And again the din broke out, and the uproar was frightful. Monsieur J. screamed out across the theatre, Svengali, Svengali, qu'est-ce qu'elle a donc, votre femme? Elle est devenue folle. Indeed, she had tried to sing Benbolt, but had sung it in her old way, as she used to sing it in the Quartier Latin, the most lamentably grotesque performance ever heard out of a human throat. Svengali, Svengali, shrieked poor Monsieur J., gesticulating towards the box where Svengali was sitting, quite impassible, gazing at Monsieur J., and smiling a ghastly sardonic smile, a rictus of hate and triumphant revenge, as if he was saying, I've got the laugh of you all this time. Taffy, the laird, little Billy, the whole house were now staring at Svengali, and his wife was forgotten. She stood vacantly looking at everybody and everything, the chandelier, Monsieur J., Svengali in his box, the people in the stalls, in the gallery, and smiling as if the noisy scene amused and excited her. Svengali, Svengali, Svengali! The whole house took up the cry derisively. Monsieur J. led Madame Svengali away. She seemed quite passive. That terrible figure of Svengali sat still, immovable, watching his wife's retreat, still smiling his ghastly smile. All eyes were now turned on him once more. Monsieur J. was then seen to enter his box with a policeman and 2 or 3 other men, one of them in evening dress. He quickly drew the curtains to. Then, a minute or 2 after, he reappeared on the platform, bowing and scraping to the audience, as pale as death, and called for silence, the gentleman in evening dress by his side, and this person explained that a very dreadful thing had happened, that Monsieur Svengali had suddenly died in that box of apoplexy or heart disease, that his wife had seen it from her place on the stage, and had apparently gone out of her senses, which accounted for her extraordinary behavior. He added that the money would be returned at the doors, and begged the audience to disperse quietly. Taffy, with his 2 friends behind him, forced his way to a stage door he knew. The laird had no longer any doubts on the score of Trilby's identity. This Trilby, at all events. Taffy knocked and thumped till the door was opened, and gave his card to the man who opened it, stating that he and his friends were old friends of Madame Svengali and must see her at once. The man tried to slam the door in his face, but Taffy pushed through and shut it on the crowd outside, and insisted on being taken to Monsieur J. immediately, and was so authoritative and big, and looked such a swell, that the man was cowed and led him. They passed an open door, through which they had a glimpse of a prostrate form on a table, a man partially undressed, and some men bending over him, doctors probably. That was the last they saw of Svengali. Then they were taken to another door, and Monsieur J. came out, and Taffy explained who they were, and they were admitted. La Svengali was there, sitting in an armchair by the fire, while several of the band stood round, gesticulating and talking German or Polish or Yiddish. Gecko on his knees was alternately chafing her hands and feet. She seemed quite dazed. But at the sight of Taffy she jumped up and rushed at him, saying, "Oh, Taffy dear! Oh, Taffy! What's it all about? Where on earth am I? What an age since we met!" Then she caught sight of the laird and kissed him. And then she recognized little Billy. She looked at him for a long while in great surprise, and then shook hands with him. "How pale you are! And so changed! You've got a moustache. What's the matter? Why are you all dressed in black with white cravats, as if you were going to a funeral? Where's Svengali? I should like to go home." What do you call home? I mean, where is it?" asked Taffy. "C'est à l'hôtel de Normandie dans le Haymarket. On va vous y conduire, madame," said Monsieur J. "Oui, c'est ça," said Trilby. "Hôtel de Normandie. Mais Svengali, où est-ce qu'il est?" "Est là, madame. Il est très malade." "Malade? Qu'est-ce qu'il a? How funny you look with your moustache, little Billy. Dear, dear little Billy, so pale, so very pale. Are you ill too? Oh, I hope not. How glad I am to see you again. You can't tell. Though I promised your mother I wouldn't. Never, never. Where are we now, dear little Billy?" Monsieur J. seemed to have lost his head. He was constantly running in and out of the room, distracted. The bandsmen began to talk and try to explain in incomprehensible French to Taffy. Gecko seemed to have disappeared. It was a bewildering business. Noises from outside, the tramp and bustle and shouts of the departing crowd, people running in and out and asking for Monsieur J., policemen, firemen, and what not. Then little Billy, who had been exerting the most heroic self-control, suggested that Trilby should come to his house in Fitzroy Square, first of all, and be taken out of all this, and the idea struck Taffy as a happy one, and it was proposed to Monsieur J., who saw that our three friends were old friends of Madame Svengali's, and people to be trusted, and he was only too glad to be relieved of her, and gave his consent. Little Billy and Taffy drove to Fitzroy Square to prepare little Billy's landlady, who was much put out at first having such a novel and unexpected charge imposed on her. It was all explained to her that it must be so, that Madame Svengali, the greatest singer in Europe and an old friend of her tenants, had suddenly gone out of her mind from grief at the tragic death of her husband, and that for this night at least the unhappy lady must sleep under that roof, indeed in little Billy's own bed, and that he would sleep at a hotel, and that a nurse would be provided at once. It might be only for that one night, and that the lady was quiet as a lamb, and would probably recover her faculties after a night's rest. A doctor was sent for from close by, and soon Trilby appeared. With the laird, and her appearance and her magnificent sables impressed Mrs. Godwin. The landlady brought her figuratively on her knees. Then Taffy, the laird, and little Billy departed again and dispersed to procure a nurse for the night, to find Gecko, to fetch some of Trilby's belongings from the Hôtel de Normandie, and her maid. The maid, the old German Jewess and Svengali's relative, distracted by the news of her master's death, had gone to the theatre. Gecko was in the hands of the police. Things had got to a terrible pass, but our three friends did their best and were up most of the night. So much for La Svengali's debut in London. The present scribe was not present on that memorable occasion, and has written this inadequate and most incomplete description, partly from hearsay, and private information, partly from the reports in the contemporary newspapers. Should any surviving eyewitness of that lamentable fiasco read these pages and see any gross inaccuracy in this bald account of it, the P.S. will feel deeply obliged to the same for any corrections or additions, and these will be duly acted upon and gratefully acknowledged in all subsequent editions, which will be numerous, no doubt, on account of the great interest still felt in La Svengali, even by those who never saw or heard her, and they are many, and also because the present scribe is better qualified, by his opportunities, for the compiling of this brief biographical sketch than any person now living, with the exception, of course, of Taffy and the Laird, to whose kindness, even more than to his own personal recollections, he owes whatever it may contain of serious historical value. Next morning they all three went to Fitzroy Square. Little Billy had slept at Taffy's rooms in Jermyn Street. Trilby seemed quite pathetically glad to see them again. She was dressed simply and plainly, in black. Her trunks had been sent from the hotel. The hospital nurse was with her. The doctor had just left. He had said that she was suffering from some great nervous shock, a pretty safe diagnosis. Her wits had apparently not come back, and she seemed in no way to realize her position. "Ah, what it is to see you again, all three! It makes one feel glad to be alive. I've thought of many things, but never of this, never. 3 nice clean Englishmen, all speaking English, and such dear old friends. Ah, j'aime tant ça, c'est le ciel. I wonder I've got a word of English left." Her voice was so soft and sweet and low that these ingenious remarks sounded like a beautiful song, and she made the soft eyes at them all three, one after another, in her old way, and the soft eyes quickly filled with tears. She seemed ill and weak and worn out, and insisted on keeping the Laird's hand in hers. "What's the matter with Svengali? He must be dead." They all three looked at each other perplexed. "Ah, he's dead. I can see it in your faces. He's got heart disease." "Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, very sorry indeed. He was always very kind, poor Svengali." "Yes, he's dead," said Taffy. "And Gecko, dear little Gecko, is he dead too? I saw him last night. He warmed my hands and feet. Where were we? No, Gecko's not dead, but he's had to be locked up for a little while. He struck Svengali, you know. You saw it all." "I? No, I never saw it, but I dreamt something like it. Gecko with a knife, and people holding him, and Svengali bleeding on the ground. That was just before Svengali's illness. He'd cut himself in the neck, you know, with a rusty nail, he told me. I wonder how. But it was wrong of Gecko to strike him. They were such friends. Why did he? Well, it was because Svengali struck you with his conductor's wand when you were rehearsing. Struck you on the fingers and made you cry. Don't you remember?" "Struck me? Rehearsing? Made me cry? What are you talking about, dear Taffy? Svengali never struck me. He was kindness itself, always. And what should I rehearse?" "Well, the songs you were to sing at the theatre in the evening." "Sing at the theatre? I never sang at any theatre, except last night, if that big place was a theatre, and they didn't seem to like it. I'll take precious good care never to sing in a theatre again. How they howled! And there was Svengali in the box opposite, laughing at me. Why was I taken there? And why did that funny little Frenchman in the white waistcoat ask me to sing? I know very well I can't sing well enough to sing in a place like that. What a fool I was! It all seems like a bad dream. What was it all about? Was it a dream, I wonder? Well, but you don't remember singing at Paris, in the Salle des Bashibazouks, and at Vienna, St. Petersburg, lots of places." "What nonsense, dear! You're thinking of someone else. I never sang anywhere. I've been to Vienna and St. Petersburg, but I never sang there. Good heavens!" Then there was a pause, and our three friends looked at her helplessly. End of Part 3, Part 7th. Recording by Estelle Jobson. Part 4 of Part 7th of Trilby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Estelle Jobson. Trilby by George de MAURIER, Part 7th, Part 4. Little Billy said, "Tell me, Trilby, what made you cut me dead when I bowed to you in the Place de la Concorde, and you were riding with Svengali in that swell carriage?" "I never rode in a swell carriage with Svengali. Omnibuses were more in our line. You're dreaming, dear little Billy. You're taking me for somebody else. And as for my cutting you, why, I had sooner cut myself into little pieces." "Where were you staying with Svengali in Paris?" "I really forget. Were we in Paris? Oh, yes, of course. Hotel Bertrand, Place Notre-Dame de Victoire." "How long have you been going about with Svengali?" "Oh, months, years, I forget. I was very ill. He cured me." "Ill? What was the matter?" "Oh, I was mad with grief and pain in my eyes, and wanted to kill myself when I lost my dear little Jeannot at Vibrailles. I fancied I hadn't been careful enough with him. I was crazed. Don't you remember writing to me there, Taffy, through Angèle? Such a sweet letter you wrote. I know it by heart. And you too, Sandy." And she kissed him. "I wonder where they are, your letters. I've got nothing of my own in the world, not even your dear letters, nor little Billy's. Such lots of them." "Well, Svengali used to write to me too, and then he got my address from Angèle. When Jeannot died, I felt I must kill myself or get away from Vibrailles, get away from the people there. So when he was buried, I cut my hair short and got a workman's cap and blouse and trousers and walked all the way to Paris without saying anything to anybody. I didn't want anybody to know. I wanted to escape from Svengali, who wrote that he was coming there to fetch me. I wanted to hide in Paris. When I got there at last, it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and I was in dreadful pain, and had lost all my money, 30 francs, through a hole in my trousers pocket. Besides, I had a row with the carter in the Halles. He thought I was a man and hit me and gave me a black eye, just because I patted his horse and fed it with a carrot I'd been trying to eat myself. He was tipsy, I think. Well, I looked over the bridge at the river, just by the morgue, and wanted to jump in. But the morgue sickened me, so I hadn't the pluck. Svengali used to be always talking about the morgue and my going there some day. He used to say he'd come and look at me there, and the idea made me so sick I couldn't. I got bewildered and quite stupid. Then I went to Angèle's in the Rue des Cloîtres Saint-Pétronille and waited about. But I hadn't the courage to ring, so I went to the Place Saint-Anatole des Arts and looked up at the old studio window and thought how comfortable it was in there, with the big settee near the stove and all that, and felt inclined to ring up Madame Vinard. And then I remembered little Billy was ill there, and his mother and sister were with him. Angèle had written me, you know. Poor little Billy. There he was, very ill. So I walked about the place and up and down the Rue des Trois Mauvais Ladres. Then I went down the Rue de Seine to the river again, and again I hadn't the pluck to jump in. Besides, there was the sergeant de ville, who followed and watched me. And the fun of it was that I knew him quite well, and he didn't know me a bit. It was Célestin Beaumolet, who got so tipsy on Christmas night, don't you remember, the tall one who was pitted with the smallpox. Then I walked about till near daylight. Then I could stand it no longer and went to Svengali's in the Rue Tireliard. But he'd moved to the Rue des Saints-Pères, and I went there and found him. I didn't want to, a bit, but I couldn't help myself. It was fate, I suppose. He was very kind and cured me almost directly, and got me coffee and bread and butter, the best I ever tasted, and a warm bath from Bidet Frères in the Rue Savonarole. It was heavenly, and I slept for 2 days and 2 nights, and then he told me how fond he was of me, and how he would always cure me, and take care of me and marry me, if I would go away with him. He said he would devote his whole life to me, and took a small room for me, next to his. I stayed with him there a week, never going out or seeing anyone, mostly asleep. I'd caught a chill. He played in 2 concerts and made a lot of money, and then we went away to Germany together, and no one was a bit the wiser. And did he marry you? Well, no. He couldn't, poor fellow. He'd already got a wife living, and 3 children, which he declared were not his. They live in Elberfeld in Prussia. She keeps a small, sweet stuffed shop there. He behaved very badly to them, but it was not through me. He'd deserted them long before. But he used to send them plenty of money when he'd got any. I made him, for I was very sorry for her. He was always talking about her, and what she said and what she did, and imitating her saying her prayers and eating pickled cucumber with one hand and drinking schnapps with the other, so as not to lose any time, till he made me die of laughing. He could be very funny, Svengali, though he was German, poor dear. And then Gecko joined us, and Marta. Who's Marta? His aunt. She cooked for us and all that. She's coming here presently. She sent word from the hotel. She's very fond of him, poor Marta. Poor Gecko. What will they ever do without Svengali? Then what did he do to live? Oh, he played at concerts, I suppose, and all that. Did you ever hear him? Yes, sometimes Marta took me. At the beginning, you know, he was always very much applauded. He plays beautifully. Everybody said so. Did he never try and teach you to sing? Oh, not he. Why, he always laughed when I tried to sing, and so did Marta, and so did Gecko. It made them roar. I used to sing Ben Bolt. They used to make me, just for fun, and go into fits. I didn't mind a scrap. I'd had no training, you know. Was there anybody else he knew? Any other woman? Not that I know of. He always made out he was so fond of me that he couldn't even look at another woman. Poor Svengali. Here her eyes filled with tears again. He was always very kind, but I never could be fond of him in the way he wished. Never. It made me sick even to think of. Once I used to hate him in Paris in the studio. Don't you remember? He hardly ever left me, and then Marta looked after me, for I've always been weak and ill, and often so languid that I could hardly walk across the room. It was that 3 days' walk from Vibré to Paris. I never got over it. I used to try and do all I could, be a daughter to him, as I couldn't be anything else, mend his things and all that, and cook him little French dishes. I fancy he was very poor at one time. We were always moving from place to place. But I always had the best of everything. He insisted on that, even if he had to go without himself. It made him quite unhappy when I wouldn't eat, so I used to force myself. Then, as soon as I felt uneasy about things, or had any pain, he would say, "Dors, ma mignonne," and I would sleep at once for hours, I think, and wake up, oh, so tired, and find him kneeling by me, always so anxious and kind, and Marta and Gecko, and sometimes we had the doctor, and I was ill in bed. Gecko used to dine and breakfast with us. You've no idea what an angel he is, poor little Gecko. But what a dreadful thing to strike Svengali. Why did he? Svengali taught him all he knows. And you knew no one else? No other woman? No one that I can remember. Except Marta, not a soul. And that beautiful dress you had on last night? It isn't mine. It's on the bed upstairs, and so's the fur cloak. They belong to Marta. She's got lots of them. Lovely things. Silk, satin, velvet, and lots of beautiful jewels. Marta deals in them, and makes lots of money. I've often tried them on. I'm very easy to fit, she said, being so tall and thin. And poor Svengali would kneel down and cry, and kiss my hands and feet, and tell me I was his goddess and empress and all that, which I hate. And Marta used to cry too. And then he would say, "Et maintenant dors, ma mignonne." And when I woke up I was so tired that I went to sleep again on my own account. But he was very patient. Oh dear me, I've always been a poor helpless useless log and burden to him. Once I actually walked in my sleep and woke up in the marketplace at Prague, and found an immense crowd, and poor Svengali bleeding from the forehead, in a faint on the ground. He'd been knocked down by a horse and cart, he told me. He'd got his guitar with him. I suppose he and Gecko had been playing somewhere, for Gecko had his fiddle. If Gecko hadn't been there, I don't know what we should have done. You never saw such queer people as they were, such crowds. You'd think they'd never seen an Englishwoman before. The noise they made, and the things they gave me. Some of them went down on their knees and kissed my hands and the skirts of my gown. He was ill in bed for a week after that, and I nursed him, and he was very grateful. Poor Svengali! God knows I felt grateful to him for many things. Tell me how he died. I hope he hadn't much pain. They told her it was quite sudden, from heart disease. Ah, I knew he had that. He wasn't a healthy man. He used to smoke too much. Martha used always to be very anxious. Just then Martha came in. Martha was a fat elderly Jewess of a rather grotesque and ignoble type. She seemed overcome with grief, but all prostrate. Trilby hugged and kissed her, and took off her bonnet and shawl, and made her sit down in a big armchair, and got her a footstool. She couldn't speak a word of anything but Polish and a little German. Trilby had also picked up a little German, and with this, and by means of signs, and no doubt through a long intimacy with each other's ways, they understood each other very well. She seemed a very good old creature, and very fond of Trilby, but in mortal terror of the 3 Englishmen. Lunch was brought up for the 2 women and the nurse, and our friends left them, promising to come again that day. They were utterly bewildered, and the laird would have it that there was another Madame Svengali somewhere, the real one, and that Trilby was a fraud, self-deceived and self-deceiving, quite unconsciously so, of course. Truth looked out of her eyes, as it always had done. Truth was in every line of her face. The truth only, nothing but the truth could ever be told in that voice of velvet, which rang as true when she spoke as that of any thrush or nightingale, however rebellious it might be now, and for ever perhaps, to artificial melodic laws and limitations and restraints. The long training it had been subjected to had made it a wonder, a world's delight, and though she might never sing another note, her mere speech would always be more golden than any silence, whatever she might say. Except on the one particular point of her singing, she had seemed absolutely sane. So, at least, thought Taffy, the laird, and little Billy. And each thought to himself, besides, that this last incarnation of Trilbiness was quite the sweetest, most touching, most endearing of all. They had not failed to note how rapidly she had aged. Now that they had seen her without her rouge and pearl powder, she looked 30 at least. She was only 23. Her hands were almost transparent in their waxen whiteness. Delicate little frosty wrinkles had gathered round her eyes. There were grey streaks in her hair. All strength and straightness and elasticity seemed to have gone out of her with the memory of her endless triumphs, if she really was La Svengali, and of her many wanderings from city to city all over Europe. It was evident enough that the sudden stroke which had destroyed her power of singing had left her physically a wreck. But she was one of those rarely gifted beings who cannot look or speak or even stir without waking up and satisfying some vague longing that lies dormant in the hearts of most of us, men and women alike. Grace, charm, magnetism, whatever the nameless seduction should be called that she possessed to such an unusual degree, she had lost none of it when she lost her high spirits, her buoyant health and energy, her wits. Tuneless and insane, she was more of a siren than ever, a quite unconscious siren, without any guile, who appealed to the heart all the more directly and irresistibly that she could no longer stir the passions. All this was keenly felt by all 3, each in his different way, by Taffy and little Billy especially. All her past life was forgiven, her sins of omission and commission, and whatever might be her fate, recovery, madness, disease, or death, the care of her till she died or recovered should be the principal business of their lives. Both had loved her, all 3 perhaps. One had been loved by her as passionately, as purely, as unselfishly as any man could wish to be loved, and in some extraordinary manner had recovered after many years at the mere sudden sight and sound of her. His lost share in our common inheritance, the power to love and all its joys and sorrow, without which he had found life not worth living, though he had possessed every other gift and blessing in such abundance. "O Circe, poor Circe, dear Circe, divine enchantress that you were," he said to himself in his excitable way, "a mere look from your eyes, a mere note of your heavenly voice, has turned a poor, miserable, callous brute back into a man again, and I will never forget it, never. And now that a still worse trouble than mine has befallen you, you shall always be first in my thoughts till the end." And Taffy felt pretty much the same, though he was not by way of talking to himself so eloquently about things as little Billy. As they lunched, they read the accounts of the previous evening's events in different papers, 3 or 4 of which, including the Times, had already got leaders about the famous but unhappy singer who had been so suddenly widowed and struck down in the midst of her glory. All these accounts were more or less correct. In one paper it was mentioned that Madame Svengali was under the roof and care of Mr. William Bagor, the painter, in Fitzroy Square. The inquest on Svengali was to take place that afternoon, and also Gecko's examination at the Bow Street Police Court for his assault. Taffy was allowed to see Gecko, who was remanded till the result of the post-mortem and should be made public. But beyond inquiring most anxiously and minutely after Trilby, and betraying the most passionate concern for her, he would say nothing and seemed indifferent as to his own fate. When they went to Fitzroy Square late in the afternoon, they found that many people, musical, literary, fashionable, and otherwise, and many foreigners, had called to inquire after Madame Svengali, but no one had been admitted to see her. Mrs. Godwin was much elated by the importance of her new lodger. Trilby had been writing to Angèle Boisse at her old address in the Rue des Cloîtres Saint-Pétronille, in the hope that this letter would find her still there. She was anxious to go back and be a blanchisseuse de fin with her friend. It was a kind of nostalgia for Paris, the Quartier Latin, her clean old trade. This project our 3 heroes did not think it necessary to discuss with her just yet. She seemed quite unfit for work of any kind. The doctor, who had seen her again, had been puzzled by her strange physical weakness, and wished for a consultation with some special authority. Little Billy, who was intimate with most of the great physicians, wrote about her to Sir Oliver Calthorpe. She seemed to find a deep happiness in being with her 3 old friends, and talked and listened with all her old eagerness and geniality, and much of her old gaiety, in spite of her strange and sorrowful position. But for this it was impossible to realize that her brain was affected in the slightest degree, except when some reference was made to her singing, and this seemed to annoy and irritate her, as though she were being made fun of. The whole of her marvelous musical career, and everything connected with it, had been clean wiped out of her recollection. She was very anxious to get into other quarters, that little Billy should suffer no inconvenience, and they promised to take rooms for her and Martha on the morrow. They told her cautiously all about Svengali and Gecko. She was deeply concerned, but betrayed no such poignant anguish as might have been expected. The thought of Gecko troubled her most, and she showed much anxiety as to what might befall him. Next day she moved with Martha to some lodgings in Charlotte Street, where everything was made as comfortable for them as possible. Sir Oliver saw her with Dr. Thorne, the doctor who was attending her, and Dr. Jakes Talboys. Sir Oliver took the greatest interest in her case, both for her sake and his friend little Billy's, also his own, for he was charmed with her. He saw her 3 times in the course of the week, but could not say for certain what was the matter with her, beyond taking the very gravest view of her condition. For all he could advise or prescribe, her weakness and physical prostration increased rapidly, through no cause he could discover. Her insanity was not enough to account for it. She lost weight daily. She seemed to be wasting and fading away from sheer general atrophy. 2 or 3 times he took her and Martha for a drive. On one of these occasions, as they went down Charlotte Street, she saw a shop with transparent French blinds in the window, and through them some French women with neat white caps ironing. It was a French blanchisserie de fin, and the sight of it interested and excited her so much that she must needs insist on being put down and on going into it. Je voudrais bien parler à la patronne, si ça ne le dérange pas, she said. The patronne, a genial Parisian, was much astonished to hear a great French lady, in costly garments, evidently a person of fashion and importance, applying to her rather humbly for employment in the business, and showing a thorough knowledge of the work, and of the Parisian workwoman's colloquial dialect. Martha managed to catch the patron's eye, and tapped her own forehead significantly, and Sir Oliver nodded. So the good woman humoured the great lady's fancy, and promised her abundance of employment whenever she should want it. Employment! Poor Trilby was hardly strong enough to walk back to the carriage, and this was her last outing. But this little adventure had filled her with hope and good spirits, for she had as yet received no answer from Angèle Boisse, who was in Marseille, and had begun to realize how dreary the Quartier Latin would be without Journaux, without Angèle, without the Trois Angliches in the Place Saint-Anatole des Arts. She was not allowed to see any of the strangers who came and made kind inquiries. This her doctors had strictly forbidden. Any reference to music or singing irritated her beyond measure. She would say to Martha in bad German, "Tell them, Martha, what nonsense it is. They are taking me for another. They are mad. They are trying to make a fool of me." And Martha would betray a great uneasiness, almost terror, when she was appealed to in this way. End of Part 7th. Recording by Estelle Jobson, Rome, Italy. Part 1 of Part 8 of Trilby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Estelle Jobson. Trilby by Georges de Maurier, Part 8, Part 1. La vie est vaine, un peu d'amour, un peu de haine, et puis bonjour. La vie est brève, un peu d'espoir, un peu de rêve, et puis bonsoir. Svengali had died from heart disease. The cut he had received from Gecko had not apparently, as far as the verdict of a coroner's inquest could be trusted, had any effect in aggravating his malady or hastening his death. But Gecko was sent for trial at the Old Bailey, and sentenced to hard labour for 6 months, a sentence which, if I remember right, gave rise to much comment at the time. Taffy saw him again, but with no better result than before. He chose to preserve an obstinate silence on his relations with the Svengalis and their relations with each other. When he was told how hopelessly ill and insane Madame Svengali was, he shed a few tears, and said, "Ah, pauvrette, pauvrette, ah, monsieur, je l'aimais tant, je l'aimais tant. Il n'y en a pas beaucoup comme elle, Dieu de misère, c'est un ange du paradis." And not another word was to be got out of him. It took some time to settle Svengali's affairs after his death. No will was found. His old mother came over from Germany, and 2 of his sisters, but no wife. The comic wife and the 3 children, and the sweet stuff shop in Elberfeld had been humorous inventions of his own, a kind of Mrs. Harris. He left £3,000, every penny of which, and of far larger sums that he had spent, had been earned by La Svengali. But nothing came to Trilby of this, nothing but the clothes and jewels he had given her, and in this respect he had been lavish enough, and there were countless costly gifts from emperors, kings, great people of all kinds. Trilby was under the impression that all these belonged to Martha. Martha behaved admirably. She seemed bound hand and foot to Trilby by a kind of slavish adoration, as that of a plain old mother for a brilliant and beautiful but dying child. It soon became evident that, whatever her disease might be, Trilby had but a very short time to live. She was soon too weak even to be taken out in a bath chair, and remained all day in her large sitting-room with Martha, and there, to her great and only joy, she received her 3 old friends every afternoon, and gave them coffee and made them smoke cigarettes of Caporal as of old. And their hearts were daily harrowed as they watched her rapid decline. Day by day she grew more beautiful in their eyes, in spite of her increasing pallor and emaciation. Her skin was so pure and white and delicate, and the bones of her face so admirable. Her eyes recovered all their old humorous brightness when les Trois Angliches were with her, and the expression of her face was so wistful and tender for all her playfulness, so full of eager clinging to existence and to them, that they felt the memory of it would haunt them for ever, and be the sweetest and saddest memory of their lives. Her quick though feeble gestures, full of reminiscences of the vigorous and lively girl they had known a few years back, sent waves of pity through them, and pure brotherly love, and the incomparable tones and changes and modulations of her voice, as she chatted and laughed, bewitched them almost as much as when she had sung the Nussbaum of Schumann in the Salle des Bachibazouk. Sometimes Lorimer came, and Antony and the Greek. It was like a genial little court of Bohemia. and Lorimer, Antony, the laird, and little Billy made those beautiful chalk and pencil studies of her head, which are now so well known, all so singularly like her, and so singularly unlike each other. Trilby vu à travers quatre tempéraments. These afternoons were probably the happiest poor Trilby had ever spent in her life, with these dear people around her, speaking the language she loved, talking of old times and jolly Paris days. She never thought of the morrow. But later at night, in the small hours, she would wake up with a start from some dream full of tender and blissful recollections, and suddenly realize her own mischance, and feel the icy hand of that which was to come before many morrows were over, and taste the bitterness of death so keenly that she longed to scream out loud, and get up and walk up and down, and wring her hands at the dreadful thought of parting for ever. But she lay motionless and mum as a poor little frightened mouse in a trap, for fear of waking up the good old tired Martha, who was snoring at her side. And in an hour or two the bitterness would pass away, the creeps and the horrors, and the stoical spirit of resignation would steal over her, the balm, the blessed calm, and all her old bravery would come back. And then she would sink into sleep again, and dream more blissfully than ever, till the good Martha woke her with a motherly kiss and a fragrant cup of coffee, and she would find, feeble as she was, and doomed as she felt herself to be, that joy cometh of a morning, and life was still sweet for her, with yet a whole day to look forward to. One day she was deeply moved at receiving a visit from Mrs. Baggor, who, at little Billy's earnest desire, had come all the way from Devonshire to see her. As the graceful little lady came in, pale and trembling all over, Trilby rose from her chair to receive her, and rather timidly put out her hand, and smiled in a frightened manner. Neither could speak for a second. Mrs. Baggor stood stock still by the door, gazing with all her heart in her eyes at the so terribly altered Trilby, the girl she had once so dreaded. Trilby, who seemed also bereft of motion, and whose face and lips were ashen, exclaimed, "I am afraid I haven't quite kept my promise to you, after all. But things have turned out so differently. Anyhow, you needn't have any fear of me now." At the mere sound of that voice, Mrs. Baggor, who was as impulsive, emotional, and unregulated as her son, rushed forward, crying, "Oh, my poor girl, my poor girl!" and caught her in her arms, and kissed and caressed her, and burst into a flood of tears, and forced her back into her chair, hugging her as if she were a long-lost child. "I love you now as much as I always admired you. Pray believe it." "Oh, how kind of you to say that," said Trilby, her own eyes filling. "I'm not at all the dangerous or designing person you thought. I knew quite well I wasn't a proper person to marry your son all the time, and told him so again and again. It was very stupid of me to say yes at last. I was miserable directly after, I assure you. Somehow I couldn't help myself. I was driven. Oh, don't talk of that, don't talk of that. You've never been to blame in any way. I've long known it. I've been full of remorse. You've been in my thoughts always, night and day. Forgive a poor jealous mother. As if any man could help loving you, or any woman either. Forgive me." "Oh, Mrs. Baggor, forgive you? What a funny idea! But anyhow you have forgiven me, and that's all I care for now. I was very fond of your son, as fond as could be. I am now, but in quite a different sort of way, and you know, the sort of way you must be, I fancy. There was never another like him that I ever met, anywhere. You must be so proud of him. Who wouldn't? Nobody's good enough for him. I would have been only too glad to be his servant, his humble servant. I used to tell him so, but he wouldn't hear of it. He was much too kind. He always thought of others before himself. And oh, how rich and famous he's become! I've heard all about it, and it did me good. It does me more good to think of than anything else, far more than if I were to ever be so rich and famous myself, I can tell you. This from Svengali, whose overpowering fame, so utterly forgotten by herself, was still ringing all over Europe, whose lamentable illness and approaching death were being mourned and discussed and commented upon in every capital of the civilized world, as one distressing bulletin appeared after another. She might have been a royal personage. Mrs. Bagot knew, of course, the strange form her insanity had taken, and made no allusion to the flood of thoughts that rushed through her own brain as she listened to this towering goddess of song, this poor mad queen of the nightingales, humbly gloating over her son's success. Poor Mrs. Bagot had just come from Little Billy's in Fitzroy Square, close by. There she had seen Taffy in a corner of Little Billy's studio, laboriously answering endless letters and telegrams from all parts of Europe, for the good Taffy had constituted himself Trilby's secretary and homme d'affaires, unknown to her, of course. And this was no sinecure, though he liked it. Putting aside the numerous people he had to see and be interviewed by, there were kind inquiries and messages of condolence and sympathy from nearly all the crowned heads of Europe through their chamberlains, applications for help from unsuccessful musical stragglers all over the world to the pre-eminently successful one, beautiful letters from great and famous people, musical or otherwise, disinterested offers of service, interested proposals for engagements when the present trouble should be over, beggings for an interview from famous impresarios, to obtain which no distance would be thought too great, etc., etc., etc. It was endless in English, French, German, Italian, in languages quite incomprehensible. Many letters had to remain unanswered. Taffy took an almost malicious pleasure in explaining all this to Mrs. Bagot. Then there was a constant rolling of carriages up to the door, and a thundering of Little Billy's knocker. Lord and Lady Palmerston wish to know. The Lord Chief Justice wishes to know. The Dean of Westminster wishes to know. The Marchioness of Westminster wishes to know. Everybody wishes to know if there is any better news of Madame Svengali. These were small things truly, but Mrs. Bagot was a small person, from a small village in Devonshire, and one whose heart and eye had hitherto been filled by no larger image than that of Little Billy. And Little Billy's fame, as she now discovered for the first time, did not quite fill the entire universe. And she mustn't be too much blamed if all these obvious signs of a world-wide colossal celebrity impressed and even awed her a little. Madame Svengali! Why, this was the beautiful girl whom she remembered so well, whom she had so grandly discarded with a word, and who had accepted her congé so meekly in a minute, whom, indeed, she had been cursing in her heart for years, because what? Poor Mrs. Bagot felt herself turn hot and red all over, and humbled herself to the very dust, and almost forgot that she had been in the right, after all, and that la grande Trilby was certainly no fit match for her son. So she went quite humbly to see Trilby, and found a poor, pathetic, mad creature still more humble than herself, who still apologized for what? A poor, pathetic, mad creature who had clean forgotten that she was the greatest singer in all the world, one of the greatest artists that had ever lived, but who remembered with shame and contrition that she had once taken the liberty of yielding, after endless pressure and repeated disinterested refusals of her own, and out of sheer irresistible affection, to the passionate pleadings of a little obscure art student, a mere boy, no better off than herself, just as penniless and insignificant a nobody, but the son of Mrs. Bagot. All due sense of proportion died out of the poor lady as she remembered and realized all this. And then Trilby's pathetic beauty, so touching, so winning in its rapid decay, the nameless charm of look and voice and manner that was her special appanage, and which her malady and singular madness had only increased, her childlike simplicity, her transparent forgetfulness of self, all these so fascinated and entranced Mrs. Bagot, whose quick susceptibility to such impressions was just as keen as her son's, that she very soon found herself all but worshipping this fast-fading lily, for so she called her in her own mind, quite forgetting, or affecting to forget, on what very questionable soil the lily had been reared, and through what strange vicissitudes of evil and corruption it had managed to grow so tall and white and fragrant. Oh, strange, compelling power of weakness and grace and prettiness combined, and sweet, sincere, unconscious, natural manners, not to speak of world-wide fame. For Mrs. Bagor was just a shrewd little conventional British country matron of the good upper-middle-class type, bristling all over with provincial proprieties and respectabilities, a Philistine of the Philistines, in spite of her artistic instincts, one who for years had, rather unjustly, thought of Trilby as a wanton and perilous siren, an unchaste and unprincipled and most dangerous daughter of Heth, and the special enemy of her house. And here she was, like all the rest of us monads and nomads and bohemians, just sitting at Trilby's feet, a washerwoman, a figure model, and heaven knows what besides, and she had never even heard her sing. It was truly comical to see and hear. Mrs. Bagor did not go back to Devonshire. She remained in Fitzroy Square at her son's, and spent most of her time with Trilby, doing and devising all kinds of things to distract and amuse her, and lead her thoughts gently to heaven, and soften for her the coming end of all. Trilby had a way of saying, and especially of looking, "Thank you," that made one wish to do as many things for her as one could, if only to make her say and look it again. And she had retained much of her old, quaint, and amusing manner of telling things, and had much to tell still left of her wandering life, although there were so many strange lapses in her powers of memory, gaps, which, if they could only have been filled up, would have been full of such surpassing interest. Then she was never tired of talking and hearing of little Billy, and that was a subject of which Mrs. Bagor could never tire either. Then there were the recollections of her childhood. One day, in a drawer, Mrs. Bagor came upon a faded daguerreotype of a woman in a tam o' shanter, with a face so sweet and beautiful and saint-like that it almost took her breath away. It was Trilby's mother. "Who and what was your mother, Trilby?" "Ah, poor mamma," said Trilby, and she looked at the portrait a long time. "Ah, she was ever so much prettier than that. Mamma was once a demoiselle de comptoir, that's a barmaid, you know, at the Montagnard Écossais, in the Rue du Paradis Poissonnière, a place where men used to drink and smoke without sitting down. That was unfortunate, wasn't it? Papa loved her with all his heart, although of course she wasn't his equal. They were married at the embassy in the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré. Her parents weren't married at all. Her mother was the daughter of a boatman on Loch Ness near a place called Drumnadrochit, but her father was the Honourable Colonel Desmond. He was related to all sorts of great people in England and Ireland. He behaved very badly to my grandmother and to poor mamma, his own daughter, deserted them both. Not very honourable of him, was it? And that's all I know about him." And then she went on to tell of the home in Paris that might have been so happy but for her father's passion for drink, of her parents' deaths, and little Jeannot, and so forth, and Mrs. Bagor was much moved and interested by these naive revelations, which accounted in a measure for so much that seemed unaccountable in this extraordinary woman, who thus turned out to be a kind of cousin, though on the wrong side of the blanket, to no less a person than the famous Duchess of Towers. With what joy would that ever kind and gracious lady have taken poor Trilby to her bosom had she only known! She had once been all the way from Paris to Vienna merely to hear her sing. But unfortunately the Svengalis had just left for St. Petersburg, and she had her long journey for nothing. Mrs. Bagor brought her many good books and read them to her. Dr. Cummings on the approaching end of the world, and other works of a like comforting tendency for those who are just about to leave it, the Pilgrim's Progress, sweet little tracts, and what not. Trilby was so grateful that she listened with much patient attention. Only now and then a faint gleam of amusement would steal over her face, and her lips would almost form themselves to ejaculate, "Oh my eye!" Then Mrs. Bagor, as a reward for such winning docility, would read her David Copperfield, and that was heavenly indeed. But the best of all was for Trilby to look over John Leech's Pictures of Life and Character, just out. She had never seen any drawings of Leech before, except now and then in an occasional punch that turned up in the studio in Paris, and they never palled upon her, and taught her more of the aspect of English life, the life she loved, than any book she had ever read. She laughed and laughed, and it was almost as sweet to listen to as if she were vocalizing the quick part in Chopin's Impromptu. One day she said, her lips trembling, "I can't make out why you're so wonderfully kind to me, Mrs. Bagor. I hope you have not forgotten who and what I am, and what my story is. I hope you haven't forgotten that I'm not a respectable woman." "Oh, my dear child, don't ask me. I only know that you are you, and I am I, and that is enough for me. You're my poor, gentle, patient, suffering daughter, whatever else you are, more sinned against than sinning, I feel sure. But there, I've misjudged you so, and been so unjust, that I would give worlds to make you some amends. Besides, I should be just as fond of you if you'd committed a murder, I really believe. You're so strange. You're irresistible. Did you ever in all your life meet anybody that wasn't fond of you?" Trilby's eyes moistened with tender pleasure at such a pretty compliment. Then, after a few minutes' thought, she said, with engaging candour, and quite simply, "No, I can't say I ever did, that I can think of just now, but I've forgotten such a lot of people." End of Part 1, Part 8. Recording by Estelle Jobson, Rome, Italy. Part 2 of Part 8 of Trilby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Estelle Jobson. Trilby by George de Maurier, Part 8, Part 2. One day Mrs. Bagor told Trilby that her brother-in-law, Mr. Thomas Bagor, would much like to come and talk to her. "Was that the gentleman who came with you to the studio in Paris?" "Yes." "Why, he's a clergyman, isn't he? What does he want to come and talk to me about?" "Ah, my dear child," said Mrs. Bagor, her eyes filling. Trilby was thoughtful for a while, and then said, "I'm going to die, I suppose." Oh yes, there's no mistake about that." "Dear Trilby, we are all in the hands of an almighty merciful God." And the tears rolled down Mrs. Bagor's cheeks. After a long pause, during which she gazed out of the window, Trilby said, in an abstracted kind of way, as though she were talking to herself, "Après tout, c'est pas déjà si raide de claquer. J'en ai tant vu qui ont passé par là. Au but du fossé la culbute, ma foi." "What are you saying to yourself in French, Trilby? Your French is so difficult to understand." "Oh, I beg your pardon. I was thinking it's not so difficult to die, after all. I've seen such lots of people do it. I've nursed them, you know, Papa and Mamma and Jeannot and Angèle Boisse's mother-in-law and a poor casseur de pierre, Colin Maigret, who lived in the Impasse des Taupes Saint-Germain. He'd been run over by an omnibus in the Rue Vaugirard, and had to have both his legs cut off just above the knee. They none of them seemed to mind dying a bit. They weren't a bit afraid. I'm not. Poor people don't think much of death. Rich people shouldn't either. They should be taught when they're quite young to laugh at it and despise it, like the Chinese. The Chinese die of laughing just as their heads are being cut off, and cheat the executioner. It's all in the day's work, and we're all in the same boat. So who's afraid? Dying is not all, my poor child. Are you prepared to meet your Maker face to face? Have you ever thought about God and the possible wrath to come if you should die unrepentant?" "Oh, but I shan't. I've been repenting all my life. Besides, there'll be no wrath for any of us, not even the worst. Il y aura amnistie générale. Papa told me so. And he'd been a clergyman, like Mr. Thomas Bagor. I often think about God. I'm very fond of him. One must have something perfect to look up to and be fond of, even if it's only an idea, even if it's too good to be true. Though some people don't even believe he exists. Le Père Martin didn't. But of course he was only a chiffonnier and doesn't count. One day, though, Durien, the sculptor, who's very clever, and a very good fellow indeed, said, Vois-tu, Trilby, I'm very much afraid he doesn't really exist, le bon Dieu. Most unfortunately for me, for I adore him. I never do a piece of work without thinking how nice it would be if I could only please him with it. And I've often thought myself how heavenly it must be to be able to paint, or sculpt, or make music, or write beautiful poetry for that very reason. Why, once on a very hot afternoon we were sitting, a lot of us, in the courtyard outside La Mère Martin's shop, drinking coffee with an old invalid called Bastide l'Endormi, one of the vieille garde, who'd only got one leg and one arm and one eye, and everybody was very fond of him. Well, a model called Mimi la Salope came out of the Mont de Piété opposite, and Père Martin called out to her to come and sit down, and gave her a cup of coffee, and asked her to sing. She sang a song of Béranger's about Napoleon the Great, in which it says, Parlez-nous de lui, grand-mère, grand-mère, parlez-nous de lui. I suppose she sang it very well, for it made old Bastide l'Endormi cry, and when Père Martin blagued him about it, he said, C'est égal, voyez-vous, to sing like that is to pray. And then I thought how lovely it would be if I could only sing like Mimi la Salope, and I've thought so ever since, just to pray. What, Trilby? If you could only sing like... Oh, but never mind, I forgot. Tell me, Trilby, do you ever pray to him as other people pray? Pray to him? Well, no, not often. Not in words and on my knees and with my hands together, you know. Thinking's praying, very often. Don't you think so? And so's being sorry and ashamed when one's done a mean thing, and glad when one's resisted a temptation, and grateful when it's a fine day and one's enjoying oneself without hurting anyone else. What is it but praying when you try and bear up after losing all you cared to live for? And very good praying, too. There can be prayers without words just as well as songs, I suppose. And Svengali used to say that songs without words are the best. And then it seems mean to be always asking for things. Besides, you don't get them any the faster that way, and that shows. La Mère Martin used to be always praying, and Père Martin said always to laugh at her, yet he always seemed to get the things he wanted oftenest. I prayed once very hard indeed. I prayed for Jeannot not to die. Well, but how do you repent, Trilby, if you do not humble yourself and pray for forgiveness on your knees? Oh, well, I don't exactly know. Look here, Mrs. Bagor, I'll tell you the lowest and meanest thing I ever did. Mrs. Bagor felt a little nervous. I'd promised to take Jeannot on Palm Sunday to Saint-Philippe-du-Roule, to hear l'Abbé Bergamo. But Durien, that's the sculptor, you know, asked me to go with him to Saint-Germain, where there was a fair or something, and with Mathieu, who was a student in law, and a certain Victorine Letellier, who was Mathieu's mistress, in fact, a lace mender in the Rue Sainte-Mariton-la-Pocharde. And so I went on Sunday morning to tell Jeannot that I couldn't take him. He cried so dreadfully that I thought I'd give up the others and take him to Saint-Philippe as I'd promised. But then Durien and Mathieu and Victorine drove up and waited outside, and so I didn't take him, and went with them, and I didn't enjoy anything at all. I was miserable. They were in an open carriage with 2 horses. It was Mathieu's treat, and Jeannot might have ridden on the box by the coachman without being in anybody's way. But I was afraid they didn't want him, as they didn't say anything, and so I didn't dare ask, and Jeannot saw us drive away, and I couldn't look back. And the worst of it is that when we were halfway to Saint-Germain, Durien said, What a pity you didn't bring Jeannot, and they were all sorry I hadn't. It was 6 or 7 years ago, and I really believe I thought of it every day, and sometimes in the middle of the night. Ah, and when Jeannot was dying, and when he was dead, the remembrance of that Palm Sunday. And if that's not repenting, I don't know what is. Oh, Trilby, what nonsense! That's nothing, good heavens, putting off a small child. I'm thinking of far worse things. When you were in that Quartier Latin, sitting to painters and sculptors, surely so attractive as you are. Oh, yes. I know what you mean. It was horrid, and I was frightfully ashamed of myself. And it wasn't amusing a bit. Nothing was, till I met your son and Taffy and dear Sandy McAllister. But then it wasn't deceiving or disappointing anybody or hurting their feelings. It was only hurting myself. Besides, all that sort of thing in women is punished severely enough down here, God knows. Unless one's a Russian empress, like Catherine the Great, or a grande dame, like lots of them, or a great genius, like Madame Rachel or George Sand. Why, if it hadn't been for that and sitting for the figure, I should have felt myself good enough to marry your son, although I was only a blanchisseuse de fin. You've said so yourself. And I should have made him a good wife, of that I feel sure. He wanted to live all his life at Barbizon and paint, and didn't care for society in the least. Anyhow, I should have been equal to such a life as that. Lots of their wives are blanchisseuses over there, or people of that sort, and they get on very well indeed, and nobody troubles about it. So I think I've been pretty well punished, richly as I've deserved to. Trilby, have you ever been confirmed? I forget. I fancy not. Oh dear, oh dear! And do you know about our blessed Saviour, and the atonement, and the incarnation, and the resurrection? Oh yes, I used to. At least, I used to have to learn the catechism on Sundays. Mamma made me. Whatever her faults and mistakes were, poor Mamma was always very particular about that. It all seemed very complicated, but Papa told me not to bother too much about it, but to be good. He said that God would make it all right for us somehow, in the end, all of us. And that seems sensible, doesn't it? He told me to be good, and not to mind what priests and clergymen tell us. He'd been a clergyman himself, and he knew all about it, he said. I haven't been very good. There's not much doubt about that, I'm afraid. But God knows I've repented often enough, and sore enough. I do now. But I'm rather glad to die, I think, and not a bit afraid, not a scrap. I believe in poor Papa, though he was so unfortunate. He was the cleverest man I ever knew, and the best, except Taffy and the laird, and your dear son. There'll be no hell for any of us, he told me so, except what we make for ourselves and each other down here, and that's bad enough for anything. He told me that he was responsible for me. He often said so, and that Mamma was too, and his parents for him, and his grandfathers and grandmothers for them, and so on up to Noah, and ever so far beyond, and God for us all. He told me always to think of other people before myself, as Taffy does, and your son, and never to tell lies or be afraid, and keep away from drink, and I should be all right. But I've sometimes been all wrong, all the same, and it wasn't Papa's fault, but poor Mamma's and mine, and I've known it and been miserable at the time and after. And I'm sure to be forgiven, perfectly certain, and so will everybody else, even the wickedest that ever lived. Why, just give them sense enough in the next world to understand all their wickedness in this, and that'll punish them enough for anything, I think. That's simple enough, isn't it? Besides, there may be no next world. That's on the cards too, and that will be simpler still. Not all the clergymen in all the world, not even the Pope of Rome, will ever make me doubt Papa, or believe in any punishment, after what we've all got to go through here. Ce sera trop bête. So that if you don't want me to very much, and he won't think it unkind, I'd rather not talk to Mr. Thomas Bagor about it. I'd rather talk to Taffy if I must. He's very clever, Taffy, though he doesn't often say such clever things as your son does, or paint nearly so well, and I'm sure he'll think Papa was right. And as a matter of fact, the good Taffy, in his opinion on this solemn subject, was found to be at one with the late Reverend Patrick Michael O'Ferrall, and so was the laird, and so, to his mother's shocked and pained surprise, was little Billy. And so were Sir Oliver Calthorpe and Sir Jakes, then Mr. Talboys, and Dr. Thorne, and Antony, and Lorimer, and the Greek. And so, in after years, when grief had well pierced and torn and riddled her through and through, and time and age had healed the wounds, and nothing remained but the consciousness of great inward scars of recollection, to remind her how deep and jagged and wide the wounds had once been, did Mrs. Bagor herself. Late on one memorable Saturday afternoon, just as it was getting dusk in Charlotte Street, Trilby, in her pretty blue dressing-gown, lay on the sofa by the fire, her head well propped, her knees drawn up, looking very placid and content. She had spent the early part of the day dictating her will to the conscientious Taffy. It was a simple document, although she was not without many valuable trinkets to leave. Quite a fortune, souvenirs from many men and women she had charmed by her singing, from royalties downward. She had been looking over them with the faithful Martha, to whom she had always thought they belonged. It was explained to her that they were gifts of Svengali's, since she did not remember when and where and by whom they were presented to her, except a few that Svengali had given her himself, with many passionate expressions of his love, which seems to have been deep and constant and sincere, none the less so, perhaps, that she could never return it. She had left the bulk of these to the faithful Martha. But to each of the Trois Angliches she had bequeathed a beautiful ring, which was to be worn by their brides if they ever married, and the brides didn't object. To Mrs. Bagor she left a pearl necklace, to Miss Bagor her gold coronet of stars, and pretty and most costly gifts to each of the 3 doctors who had attended her and been so assiduous in their care, and who, as she was told, would make no charge for attending on Madame Svengali, and studs and scarf pins to Antony, Lorimer, the Greek, Dodo, and Zuzu, and to Carnegie a little German silver vinaigrette which had once belonged to Lord Widow, and pretty souvenirs to the Wienars, Angèle Boisse, de Rien, and others. And she left a magnificent gold watch and chain to Gecko, with the most affectionate letter and £100, which was all she had in money of her own. She had taken great interest in discussing with Taffy the particular kind of trinket which would best suit the idiosyncrasy of each particular legatee, and derived great comfort from the businesslike and sympathetic conscientiousness with which the good Taffy entered upon all these minutiae. He was so solemn and serious about it, and took such pains. She little guessed how his dumb but deeply feeling heart was harrowed. This document had been duly signed and witnessed and entrusted to his care, and Trilby lay tranquil and happy, and with the sense that nothing remained for her but to enjoy the fleeting hour, and make the most of each precious moment as it went by. She was quite without pain of either mind or body, and surrounded by the people she adored, Taffy, the laird, and little Billy, and Mrs. Bagor, and Martha, who sat knitting in a corner with her black mittens on and her brass spectacles. She listened to the chat and joined in it, laughing as usual. Love in her eyes sat playing as she looked from one to another, for she loved them all beyond expression. Love on her lips was straying and warbling in her breath whenever she spoke, and her weakened voice was still larger, fuller, softer than any other voice in the room, in the world, of another kind, from another sphere. A cart drove up. There was a ring at the door, and presently a wooden packing-case was brought into the room. At Trilby's request it was opened, and found to contain a large photograph, framed and glazed, of Svengali in the military uniform of his own Hungarian band, which he had always worn until he came to Paris and London, where he conducted an ordinary evening dress. And looking straight out of the picture, straight at you, he was standing by his desk with his left hand turning over a leaf of music, and waving his baton with his right. It was a splendid photograph, by a Viennese photographer, and a most speaking likeness, and Svengali looked truly fine, all made up of importance and authority, and his big black eyes were full of stern command. Martha trembled as she looked. It was handed to Trilby, who exclaimed in surprise. She had never seen it. She had no photograph of him, and had never possessed one. No message of any kind, No letter of explanation accompanied this unexpected present, which, from the postmarks on the case, seemed to have travelled all over Europe to London, out of some remote province in eastern Russia, out of the mysterious East, the poisonous East, birthplace and home of an ill wind that blows nobody good. Trilby laid it against her legs as on a lectern, and lay gazing at it with close attention for a long time, making a casual remark now and then, as "He was very handsome, I think," or "That uniform becomes him very well. Why has he got it on, I wonder?" The others went on talking, and Mrs. Bugle made coffee. End of Part 2, Part 8. Recording by Estelle Jobson, Rome, Italy.
Part 3 of Part 8 of Trilby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.C. Guan. Trilby by Georges du Maurier. Part 8, Part 3. Presently Mrs. Baggett took a cup of tea to Trilby, and found her still staring intently at the portrait, but with her eyes dilated, and quite a strange light in them. "Trilby, Trilby, your coffee! What is the matter, Trilby?" Trilby was smiling with fixed eyes, and made no answer. The others got up and gathered round her in some alarm. Martha seemed terror-stricken, and wished to snatch the photograph away, but was prevented from doing so. One didn't know what the consequences might be. Taffy rang the bell, and sent a servant for Dr. Thorne, who lived close by, in Fitzroy Square. Presently Trilby began to speak, quite softly, in French. "Encore une fois? Bon, je veux bien, avec la voix blanche alors, n'est-ce pas? Et puis foncez au milieu, et pas trop vite en commençant. Battez bien la mesure, Svengali, que je puisse bien voir, car il fait déjà nuit. C'est ça. Allons, Gecko, donne-moi le ton." Then she smiled, and seemed to beat time softly by moving her head a little from side to side, her eyes intent on Svengalis in the portrait. And suddenly she began to sing Chopin's Impromptu in A-flat. She hardly seemed to breathe as the notes came pouring out without words, mere vocalizing. It was as if breath were unnecessary for so little voice as she was using, though there was enough of it to fill the room, to fill the house, to drown her small audience in holy, heavenly sweetness. She was a consummate mistress of her art. How that could be seen, and also how splendid had been her training! It all seemed as easy to her as opening and shutting her eyes, and yet how utterly impossible to anybody else. Between wonder, enchantment, and alarm, they were frozen to statues, all except Martha, who ran out of the room crying, "Gott im Himmel, wieder zurück, wieder zurück!" She sang it just as she had sung it at the Salle des Bachibouzouk, only it sounded still more ineffably seductive, as she was using less voice, using the essence of her voice, in fact, the pure spirit, the very cream of it. There can be little doubt that these four watchers by that enchanted couch were listening to not only the most divinely beautiful, but also the most astounding feat of musical utterance ever heard out of a human throat. The usual effect was produced. Tears were streaming down the cheeks of Mrs. Baggett and little Billy. Tears were in the laird's eyes, a tear on one of Taffy's whiskers, tears of sheer delight. When she came back to the quick movement again, after the adagio, her voice grew louder and shriller, and sweet with a sweetness not of this earth, and went on increasing in volume as she quickened the time, nearing the end, and then came the dying away into all but nothing, a mere melodic breath, and then the little soft chromatic ascending rocket up to E in alt, the last parting caress, which Svengali had introduced as a finale, for it does not exist in the piano score. When it was over, she said, Ça y est-il cette fois, Svengali? Ah, tant mieux. À la fin, c'est pas malheureux. Et maintenant, mon ami, je suis fatiguée. Bonsoir. Her head fell back on the pillow, and she lay fast asleep. Mrs. Baggett took the portrait away gently. Little Billy knelt down and held Trilby's hand in his and felt for her pulse, and could not find it. He said, "Trilby, Trilby," and put his ear to her mouth to hear her breathe. Her breath was inaudible. But soon she folded her hands across her breast, and uttered a little short sigh, and in a weak voice said, "Svengali, Svengali, Svengali." They remained in silence round her for several minutes, terror-stricken. The doctor came. He put his hand to her heart, his ear to her lips. He turned up one of her eyelids and looked at her eye, and then, his voice quivering with strong emotion, he stood up and said, "Madame Svengali's trials and sufferings are all over." "Oh, good God! Is she dead?" cried Mrs. Baggett. "Yes, Mrs. Baggett. She has been dead several minutes, perhaps a quarter of an hour." 20 ans après. Porthos Athos, alias Taffy Wine, is sitting to breakfast, opposite his wife, at a little table in the courtyard of that huge caravanserai on the Boulevard des Capucines, Paris, where he had sat more than 20 years ago with the Laird and little Billy, where in fact he had Paul Svengali's nose. Little is changed in the aspect of the place. The same cosmopolite company, with more of the American element, perhaps, the same arrivals and departures in railway omnibuses, cabs, hired carriages, and, airing his calves on the marble steps, stood just another colossal and beautiful old man in black cloth coat and knee breeches and silk stockings as of yore, with probably the very same pinchbeck chain. Where do they breed, these magnificent old Frenchmen? In Germany, perhaps, where all the good big waiters come from. And also the same fine weather. It is always fine weather in the courtyard of the Grand Hôtel. As the Laird would say, they manage these things better there. Taffy wears a short beard, which is turning grey. His kind blue eye is no longer choleric, but mild and friendly, as frank as ever, and full of humorous patience. He has grown stouter. He is very big indeed, in all 3 dimensions, but the symmetry and gainliness of the athlete belongs to him still in movement and repose, and his clothes fit him beautifully, though they are not new, and show careful beating and brushing and ironing, and even a faint suspicion of all but imperceptible fine drawing here and there. What a magnificent old man he will make some day, should the Grand Hôtel ever run short of them. He looks as if he could be trusted down to the ground, in all things, little or big, as if his word were as good as his bond, and even better, his wink as good as his word, his nod as good as his wink, and in truth, as he looks, so he is. The most cynical disbeliever in the grand old name of gentleman, and its virtues as a noun of definition, would almost be justified in quite dogmatically asserting at sight, and without even being introduced, that at all events Taffy is a gentleman, inside and out, up and down, from the crown of his head, which is getting rather bald, to the sole of his foot, by no means a small one, or a lightly shod, expuid Herculem. Indeed, this is always the first thing people say of Taffy, and the last. It means, perhaps, that he may be a trifle dull. Well, one can't be everything. Porthos was a trifle dull, and so was Athos, I think, and likewise his son, the faithful Viscount of Bragelonne, bon chien chasse de race, and so was Wilfred of Ivanhoe, the disinherited, and Eggard, the Lord of Ravenswood, and so, for that matter, was Colonel Newcome, of immortal memory. Yet who does not love them? Who would not wish to be like them, for better, for worse? Taffy's wife is unlike Taffy in many ways, but fortunately for both, very like him in some. She is a little woman, very well shaped, very dark, with black, wavy hair, and very small hands and feet, a very graceful, handsome, and vivacious person. By no means dull, full, indeed, of quick perceptions and intuitions, deeply interested in all that is going on about and around her, and with always lots to say about it, but not too much. She distinctly belongs to the rare and ever-blessed and most precious race of charmers. She had fallen in love with the stalwart Taffy more than a quarter of a century ago in the Place Saint-Anatole des Arts, where he and she and her mother had attended the sick couch of little Billy. But she had never told her love. Tout vient à point à qui sait attendre. That is a capital proverb, and sometimes even a true one. Blanche Bagot had found it to be both. One terrible night, never to be forgotten, Taffy lay fast asleep in bed, at his rooms in Jermyn Street, for he was very tired. Grief tires more than anything, and brings a deeper slumber. That day he had followed Trilby to her last home in Kensal Green, with little Billy, Mrs. Bagot, the Laird, Antony, the Greek, and Durien, who had come over from Paris on purpose, as chief mourners, and very many other people, noble, famous, or otherwise, English and foreign, a splendid and most representative gathering, as was duly chronicled in all the newspapers here and abroad, a fitting ceremony to close the brief but splendid career of the greatest pleasure-giver of our time. He was awakened by a tremendous ringing at the street door bell, as if the house were on fire, and then there was a hurried scrambling up in the dark, a tumbling over stairs and kicking against banisters, and little Billy had burst into his room, calling out, "Oh, Taffy, Taffy! I'm going mad! I'm going mad! I'm done for!" "All right, old fellow, just wait till I strike a light." "Oh, Taffy, I haven't slept for 4 nights, not a wink. She'd died with damn it, I can't get it out, that ruffian's name on her lips. It was just as if he were calling her from the tomb. She recovered her senses the very minute she saw his photograph. She was so fond of him, she forgot everybody else. She's gone straight to him, after all, in some other life, to slave for him, and sing for him, and help him to make better music than ever. Oh, oh, Taffy! Oh, catch hold, catch!" And little Billy had all but fallen on the floor in a fit, and all the old miserable business of 5 years before had begun over again. There has been too much sickness in this story, so I will tell as little as possible of poor little Billy's long illness, his slow and only partial recovery, the paralysis of his powers as a painter, his quick decline, his early death, his manly, calm, and most beautiful surrender, the wedding of the moth with the star, of the night with the morrow. For all but blameless as his short life had been, and so full of splendid promise and performance, nothing ever became him better than the way he left it, It was as if he were staring on some distant holy quest, like some gallant knight of old, a Bagot to the rescue in another life. It shook the infallibility of a certain vicar down to its very foundations, and made him think more deeply about things than he had ever thought yet. It gave him pause, and so wrung his heart that when, at the last, he stopped to kiss his poor young dead friend's pure white forehead, he dropped a bigger tear on it than little Billy, once so given to the dropping of big tears, had ever dropped in his life. But it is all too sad to write about. It was by little Billy's bedside in Devonshire that Taffy had grown to love Blanche Bagot, and not very many weeks after it was all over, that Taffy had asked her to be his wife, and in a year they were married, and a very happy marriage it turned out, the one thing that poor Mrs. Bagot still looks upon as a compensation for all the griefs and troubles of her life. During the first year or two Blanche had perhaps been the most ardently loving of the well-assorted pair. That beautiful look of love, surprised, which makes all women's eye look the same, came into hers whenever she looked at Taffy, and filled his heart with tender compunction and a queer sense of his own unworthiness. Then a boy was born to them, and that look fell on the boy, and the good Taffy caught it as it passed him by, and he felt a helpless, absurd jealousy that was none the less painful for being so ridiculous. And then that look fell on another boy, and yet another, so that it was through these boys that she looked at their father. Then his eyes caught the look, and kept it for their own use, and he grew never to look at his wife without it, and as no daughter came, she retained for life the monopoly of that most sweet and expressive regard. They are not very rich. He is a far better sportsman than he will ever be a painter, and if he doesn't sell his pictures, it is not because they are too good for the public taste. Indeed, he has no illusions on that score himself, even if his wife has. He is quite the least conceited art duffer I ever met, and I have met far many worse duffers than Taffy. Would only that I might kill off his cousin Sir Oscar, and Sir Oscar's 5 sons, the Wines are good at sons, and his 17 grandsons, and the 14 cousins, and their numerous male progeny, that stands between Taffy and the baronetcy, and whatever property goes with it, so that he might be Sir Taffy, and dear Blanche Bagot, that was, might be called my lady. This Shakespearean holocaust would scarcely cost me a pang. It is a great temptation, when you have duly slain your first hero, to enrich hero number 2 beyond the dreams of avarice, and provide him with a title and castle and park, as well as a handsome wife and a nice family. But truth is inexorable, and besides, they are just as happy as they are. They are well off enough, anyhow, to spend a week in Paris at last, and even to stop at the Grand Hôtel. Now that 2 of their sons are at Harrow, where their father was before them, and the 3rd is safe at a preparatory school at Elstree, Herts. It is their first outing since the honeymoon, and the laird should have come with them. But the good Laird of Cockpen, who is now a famous Royal Academician, is preparing for a honeymoon of his own. He has gone to Scotland to be married himself, to wed a fair and clever countrywoman of just a suitable age, for he has known her ever since she was a bright little lassie in short frocks, and he a promising A.R.A., the pride of his native Dundee, a marriage of reason, and well-seasoned affection, and mutual esteem, and therefore sure to turn out a happy one. And in another fortnight or so The pair of them will very possibly be sitting to breakfast opposite each other at that very corner table in the courtyard of the Grand Hôtel, and she will laugh at everything he says, and they will live happily ever after. So much for hero number 3, D'Artagnan. Here's to you, Sandy Mallister, canniest, genialest, and most humorous of Scots, most delicate and dainty and fanciful of British painters. I drink your health, meet your families. May you live long and prosper. So Taffy and his wife have come for their second honeymoon, their Italian summer honeymoon, alone, and are well content that it should be so. Two's always company for such a pair, the amusing one and the amusable, and they are making the most of it. They have been all over the Quartier Latin, and revisited the well-remembered spots, and even been allowed to enter the old studio, through the kindness of the concierge, who is no longer Madame Vinard. It is tenanted by 2 American painters, who are coldly civil on being thus disturbed in the middle of their work. The studio is very spick and span, and most respectable. Trilby's foot and the poem and the sheet of plate glass have been improved away, and a bookshelf put in their place. The new concierge, who has only been there a year, knows nothing of Trilby, and of the Vinards, only that they are rich and prosperous, and live somewhere in the south of France, and that Monsieur Vinard is mayor of his commune. Que le bon Dieu les bénisse, c'étaient de bien braves gens. Then Mr. and Mrs. Taffy have also been driven, in an open calèche with 2 horses, through the Bois de Boulogne to Saint-Cloud, and to Versailles, where they lunched at the Hôtel des Réservoirs. Parlez-moi de ça! And to Saint-Germain, and to Meudon, where they lunched at La Loge du Garde Champêtre, a new one. They have visited the Salon, the Louvre, the porcelain manufactory at Sèvres, the Gobelins, the Hôtel Cluny, the Invalides, with Napoleon's tomb, and seen half a dozen churches, including Notre-Dame and the Sainte-Chapelle, and dined with the Dodors and their charming villa near Asnières, and with the Zouzous and the splendid Hôtel de la Roche-Martel, with the Duriens in the Parc Monceau. Dodor's food was best and Zouzou's worst, and at Duriens the company and talk were so good that one forgot to notice the food, and that was a pity. And the young Dodors are all right, and so are the young Duriens. As for the young Zouzous, there aren't any, and that's a weight off one's mind. And they've been to the Variété and seen Madame Chaumont, and to the Français and seen Sarah Bernhardt and Coquelin and Delaunay, and to the Opera and heard Monsieur Lassalle. And today, being their last day, they are going to laze and flâne about the boulevards, and buy things, and lunch anywhere, sur le pouce, and do the Bois once more, and see tout Paris, and dine early at Durand's or Brignon's, or else the Café des Ambassadeurs, and finish up the well-spent day at the Mouche d'Espagne, the new theatre in the Boulevard Poissonnière, to see Madame Cantaridi in Petit Bonheur de Contrebande, which they are told is immensely droll and quite proper, funny without being vulgar. Dodor was their informant. He had taken Madame Dodor to see it 3 or 4 times. Madame Cantaridi, as everybody knows, is a very clever but extremely plain old woman, with a cracked voice, of spotless reputation, and the irreproachable mother of a grown-up family whom she had brought up in perfection. They have never been allowed to see their mother and grandmother act, not even the sons. Their excellent father, who adores both them and her, has drawn the line at that. In private life she is quite the lady, but on stage, well, go and see her, and you will understand how she comes to be the idol of the Parisian public. For she is the true and liberal dispenser to them of that modern esprit Gaulois which would make the good Rabelais turn uneasily in his grave and blush there like a Benedictine sister. And truly, she deserves the reverential love and gratitude of her chers Parisiens. She amused them all through the Empire during the Année Terrible. She was their only stay and comfort, and has been their chief delight ever since, and is now. When they come back from La Revanche, may Madame Cantaridi be still at her post, les mouches d'Espagne, to welcome the returning heroes, and exult and crow with them in her funny cracked old voice, or happily even console them once more, as the case may be. Victors or vanquished, they will laugh the same. Mrs. Taffy is a poor French scholar. One must know French very well indeed, and many other things besides, to seize the subtle points of Madame Cantaridi's play, and by-play. But Madame Cantaridi has so droll a face and voice, and such very droll, odd movements, that Mrs. Taffy goes into fits of laughter as soon as the quaint little old lady comes on the stage. So heartily does she laugh, that a good Parisian bourgeois turns round and remarks to his wife, "V'là une jolie petite Anglaise qui n'est pas bégueule au moins. Et le gros bœuf avec les yeux bleus en boule de loto, c'est son mari sans doute. Il n'a pas l'air trop content, par exemple, celui-là." The fact is that the good Taffy, who knows French very well indeed, is quite scandalized, and very angry with Dodor for sending them there, and as soon as the first act is finished, he means, without any fuss, to take his wife away. As he sits patiently, too indignant to laugh at what is really funny in the piece, much of it is vulgar without being funny, he finds himself watching a little white-haired man in the orchestra, a fiddler, the shape of whose back seems somehow familiar, as he plays an obligato accompaniment to a very broadly comic song of Madame Cantaridi's. He plays beautifully, like a master, and the loud applause is as much for him as for the vocalist. End of Part 3, Part 8. Recording by J.C. Guan, Montreal, July 2010. Part 4 of Part 8 of Trilby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.C. Guan. Trilby by Georges du Maurier. Part 8, Part 4. Presently, this fiddler turns his head so that his profile can be seen, and Taffy recognizes him. After 5 minutes' thought, Taffy takes a leaf out of his pocket-book and writes in perfectly grammatical French, "Dear Gecko, you have not forgotten Taffy Wine, I hope, and little Billy, and little Billy's sister, who is now Mrs. Taffy Wine. We leave Paris tomorrow, and would like very much to see you once more. Will you, after the play, come and sup with us at the Café Anglais? If so, look up and make yes with the head, and enchant. Your well devoted Taffy Wine." He gives this folded to an attendant for le premier violon, celui qui a des cheveux blancs. Presently he sees Gecko receive the note, and read it, and ponder for a while. Then Gecko looks round the theatre, and Taffy waves his handkerchief, and catches the eye of the premier violon, who makes yes with the head. And then, the first act over, Mr. and Mrs. Wine leave the theatre, Mr. explaining why, and Mrs. very ready to go, as she was beginning to feel strangely uncomfortable, without quite realizing as yet what was amiss with the lively Madame Cantaridi. They went to the Café Anglais, and bespoke a nice little room on the entresol overlooking the boulevard, and ordered a nice little supper, salami of something, very good, mayonnaise of lobster, and one or two other dishes better still, and chambertin of the best. Taffy was particular about these things on a holiday, and regardless of expense. Porthos was very hospitable, and liked good food and plenty of it, and Athos dearly loved good wine. And then they went and sat at a little round table outside of the Café de la Paix on the boulevard, near the Grand Opéra, where it is always very gay, and studied Paris life, and nursed their appetites till supper-time. At 11:30 Gecko made his appearance, very meek and humble. He looked old, 10 years older than he really was, much bowed down, and as if he had roughed it all his life, and had found living a desperate, long, hard grind. He kissed Mrs. Taffy's hand, and seemed half inclined to kiss Taffy's too, and was almost tearful in his pleasure at meeting them again, and his gratitude at being asked to sup with them. He had soft, clinging, caressing manners like a nice dog's, that made you his friend at once. He was obviously genuine and sincere, and quite pathetically simple, as he always had been. At first he could scarcely eat for nervous excitement, but Taffy's fine example and Mrs. Taffy's genial, easy-going cordiality, and a couple of glasses of chambertin, soon put him at his ease and woke up his dormant appetite, which was a very large one, poor fellow. He was told all about little Billy's death, and deeply moved to hear the cause which had brought it about, and then they talked of Trilby. He pulled her watch out of his waistcoat pocket, and reverently kissed it, exclaiming, "Ah, c'était un ange du paradis. When I tell you I lived with them for 5 years, oh, her kindness, Dio, Dio Maria! It was Gecko this, and Gecko that, and poor Gecko your toothache, how it worries me, and Gecko how tired and pale you look, you distress me so, looking like that. Shall I mix you a maitrank? And, Gecko, you love artichokes à la Barigoule. They remind you of Paris. I have heard you say so. Well, I have found out where to get artichokes, and I know how to do them à la Barigoule, and you shall have them for dinner to-day, and to-morrow, and all the week after." And we did. Ah, dear kind one, what did I really care for artichokes à la Barigoule? And it was always like that, always, and to Svengali and old Martha just the same, and she was never, well, never, toujours souffrante. And it was she who supported us all, in luxury and splendor sometimes. "And what an artist!" said Taffy. "Ah, yes, but all that was Svengali. You know Svengali was the greatest artist I ever met, monsieur. Svengali was a demon, a magician. I used to think him a god. He found me playing in the streets for copper coins, and took me by the hand, and was my only friend, and taught me all I ever knew, and yet he could not play my instrument. And now he is dead, I have forgotten how to play it myself. That English cello, it demoralized me, ruined me for ever. Ah, quel enfer, mon de Dieu! Pardon, madame. I am just good enough to play the obligato at the Mouche d'Espagne when the old Cantaridi sings. Viens, mon mari qui regarde. Prends garde, ne me chatouille plus. It does not want much of an obligato. A song so noble and so beautiful as that. And that song, monsieur, all Paris is singing it now. And that is the Paris that went mad when Trilby sang the Nussbaum of Schumann at the Salle des Bachibouzouk. You heard her? Well." And here poor Gecko tried to laugh a little sardonic laugh in falsetto, like Svengali's, full of scorn and bitterness, and very nearly succeeded. "But what made you strike him with that knife, you know?" "Ah, monsieur, it had been coming on for a long time. He used to work Trilby too hard. It was killing her. It killed her at last. And then, at the end, He was unkind to her, and scolded her and called her names, horrid names, and then one day in London he struck her. He struck her on the fingers with his baton, and she fell down on her knees and cried. Monsieur, I would have defended Trilby against a locomotive going grande vitesse, against my own father, against the Emperor of Austria, against the Pope. And I am a good Catholic, monsieur. I would have gone to the scaffold for her, and to the devil after. And he piously crossed himself. But Svengali, wasn't he very fond of her? Oh yes, monsieur. Contessa, passionately. But she did not love him as he wished to be loved. She loved little Billy, monsieur. Little Billy, the brother of Madame. And I suppose that Svengali grew angry and jealous at last. He changed as soon as he came to Paris. Perhaps Paris reminded him of little Billy, and reminded Trilby too. But how on earth did Svengali ever manage to teach her how to sing like that? She had no ear for music whatever when we knew her. Gecko was silent for a while, and Taffy filled his glass, and gave him a cigar, and lit one himself. Monsieur, no, that is true. She had not much ear, but she had such a voice as had never been heard. Svengali knew that. He had found it out long ago. Litloff had found it out too. One day Svengali heard Litloff tell Meyerbeer that the most beautiful female voice in Europe belonged to an English grisette who sat as a model to sculptors in the Quartier Latin, but that unfortunately she was quite tone-deaf and couldn't sing one single note in tune. Imagine how Svengali chuckled. I see it from here. Well, we both taught her together for 3 years, morning, noon, and night, 6-8 hours a day. It used to split me the heart to see her worked like that. We took her voice note by note. There was no end to her notes, each more beautiful than the other. Velvet and gold, beautiful flowers, pearls, diamonds, rubies, drops of dew and honey, peaches, oranges, and lemons. En veux-tu, en voilà. All the perfumes and spices of the Garden of Eden. Svengali, with his little flexible flageolet, I with my violin. That is how we taught her to make the sounds, and then how to use them. She was a phénomène, monsieur. She could keep on one note and make it go through all the colors in the rainbow, according to the way Svengali looked at her. It would make you laugh, it would make you cry, but cry or laugh, it was the sweetest, the most touching, the most beautiful note you ever heard, except all her others, and each had as many overtones as the bells in the Carillon de Notre-Dame. She could run up and down the scales, chromatic scales, quicker and better and smoother than Svengali on the piano, and more in tune than any piano. And her shake, ah, twin stars, monsieur. She was the greatest contralto, the greatest soprano the world has ever known. The like of her has never been. The like of her will never be again. And yet, she only sang in public for 2 years. Ah, those breaks and runs and sudden leaps from darkness to light and black again, from earth to heaven, those slurs and swoops and slides à la Paganini, from one note to another, like a swallow flying, or a gull. Do you remember them? How they drove you mad? Let any other singer in the world try to imitate them. They would make you sick. That was Svengali. He was a magician. And how she looked, singing. Do you remember? Her hands behind her, her dear sweet slender foot on a little stool, her thick hair lying down all along her back, and that good smile, like the Madonna's, so soft and bright and kind. Ah, Balusal di Dio! It was to make you weep for love, merely to see her. C'était à vous faire pleurer d'amour, rien que de la voir. That was Trilby, nightingale and bird of paradise in one. Enfin, she could do anything, utter any sound she liked, when once Svengali had shown her how. and he was the greatest master that ever lived, and when once she knew a thing, she knew it. Et voilà." "How strange," said Taffy, "that she should have suddenly gone out of her senses that night at Drury Lane, and so completely forgotten it all. I suppose she saw Svengali in the box opposite, and that drove her mad." And then Taffy told the little fiddler about Trilby's death song, like a swan's, and Svengali's photograph. But Gecko had heard it all from Martha, who was now dead. Gecko sat and smoked and pondered for a while, and looked from one to the other. Then he pulled himself together with an effort, so to speak, and said, "Monsieur, she never went mad, not for one moment." "What? Do you mean to say she deceived us all?" "Non, monsieur. She could never deceive anybody, and never would. She had forgotten, voilà tout." "But hang it all, my friend, one doesn't forget such a—" "Monsieur, listen. She is dead, and Svengali is dead, and Martha also. And I have a good little malady that will kill me soon, Gott sei Dank, and without much pain. I will tell you a secret. There were two Trilbys. There was the Trilby you knew, who could not sing one single note in tune. She was an angel of paradise. She is now. But she had no more idea of singing than I have of winning a steeplechase at the Croix de Berny. She could no more sing than a fiddle can play itself. She could never tell one tune from another, one note from the next. Do you remember how she tried to sing Ben Bolt that day when she first came to the studio in the Place Saint-Anatole-des-Arts? It was droll, hein? À se boucher les oreilles. Well, that was Trilby, your Trilby. That was my Trilby too, and I loved her as one loves an only love, an only sister, an only child, a gentle martyr on earth, a blessed saint in heaven. And that Trilby was enough for me. And that was the Trilby that loved your brother, madame. Oh, but with all the love that was in her, he did not know what he had lost, your brother. Her love, it was immense, like her voice, and just as full of celestial sweetness and sympathy. She told me everything. Ce pauvre Litrovili, ce qu'il a perdu. But all at once, prut, presto, Augenblick, with one wave of his hand over her, with one look of his eye, with a word, Svengali could turn her into the other Trilby, his Trilby, and make her do whatever he liked. You might have run a red-hot needle into her, and she would not have felt it. He had but to say d'or, and she suddenly became an unconscious Trilby of marble, who could produce wonderful sounds, just the sounds he wanted, and nothing else, and think his thoughts, and wish his wishes, and love him at his bidding, with a strange, unreal, factitious love, just his own love for himself turned inside out, à l'envers, and reflected back on him, as from a mirror, un écho, un simulacre, quoi, pas autre chose. It was not worth having. I was not even jealous. Well, that was the Trilby he taught how to sing, and I helped him, God of heaven forgive me. That Trilby was just a singing machine, an organ to play upon, an instrument of music, a Stradivarius, a flexible flageolet of flesh and blood, a voice and nothing more, just the unconscious voice that Svengali sang with. For it takes two to sing like La Svengali, monsieur, the one who has got the voice, and the one who knows what to do with it. So that when you heard her sing the Nussbaum, the Impromptu, you heard Svengali singing with her voice, just as you hear Joachim play a chaconne of Bach with his fiddle. Hear Joachim's fiddle. What does it know of Sebastian Bach? And as for chaconne, il s'en moque pas mal, ce fameux violon. And our Trilby, what did she know of Schumann, Chopin? Nothing at all. She mocked herself not badly of Nussbaums and impromptus. They would make her yawn to demantibulate her jaws. When Svengali's Trilby was being taught to sing, when Svengali's Trilby was singing or seemed to you as if she were singing, our Trilby had ceased to exist. Our Trilby was fast asleep. In fact, our Trilby was dead. Ah, monsieur, that Trilby of Svengali's! I have heard her sing to kings and queens in royal palaces as no woman has ever sung before or since. I have seen emperors and grand dukes kiss her hand, monsieur, and their wives and daughters kiss her lips and weep. I have seen the horses taken out of her sledge and the pick of the nobility drag her home to the hotel, with torchlights and choruses and shoutings of glory, and long life to her, and serenades all night, under the window. She never knew. She heard nothing, felt nothing, saw nothing. She bowed to them right and left, like a queen. I have played the fiddle for her while she sang in the streets, at fairs and festas and kermessen, and seen the people go mad to hear her, and once at Prague, Svengali fell down in a fit from sheer excitement, and then suddenly our Trilby woke up and wondered what it was all about. And we took him home and put him to bed and left him with Martha, and Trilby and I went together arm in arm all over the town to fetch a doctor and buy things for supper. And that was the happiest hour in all my life. Ah, what an existence, what travels, what triumphs, what adventures, things to fill a book, 1,000 books. Those 5 happy years, with those 2 Trilbys. What recollections! I think of nothing else, night or day, even as I play the fiddle for old Cantaridi. And to think how often I have played the fiddle for La Svengali. To have done that is to have lived. And then to come home to Trilby, our Trilby, the real Trilby. Gott sei Dank, ich habe geliebt und gelebt, geliebt und gelebt, geliebt und gelebt. Cristo di Dio, sweet sister in heaven, ô Dieu de misère, ayez pitié de nous. His eyes were red, and his voice was high and shrill, and tremulous and full of tears. These remembrances were too full for him, and perhaps also de Chambertin. He put his elbows on the table, and hid his face in his hands, and wept, muttering to himself in his own language, whatever that might have been, Polish probably, as if he were praying. Taffy and his wife got up and leaned on the window-bar, and looked out on the deserted boulevards, where an army of scavengers, noiseless and taciturn, was cleansing the asphalt roadway. The night above was dark, but star-dials hinted of morn, and a fresh breeze had sprung up, making the leaves dance and rustle on the sycamore trees along the boulevard. A nice little breeze, just the sort of little breeze to do Paris good. A 4-wheel cab came by at a foot-pace, the driver humming a tune. Taffy hailed him. He said, "Viens, monsieur," and drew up. Taffy rang the bell, and asked for the bill, and paid it. Gecko had apparently fallen asleep. Taffy gently woke him up, and told him how late it was. The poor little man seemed dazed and rather tipsy, and looked older than ever, 60, 70, any age you like. Taffy helped him on with his greatcoat, and, taking him by the arm, led him downstairs, giving him his card, and telling him how glad he was to have seen him, and that he would write him from England, a promise that was kept, one may be sure. Gecko uncovered his fuzzy white head, and took Mrs. Taffy's hand and kissed it, and thanked her warmly for her si bon et sympathique accueil. Then Taffy all but lifted him into the cab, the jolly cabman saying,
"Ah bon, connais bien celui-là, vous savez? Celui qui joue du violon aux mouches d'Espagne.
Il a soupé le bourgeois, n'est-ce pas, monsieur? Petite bonheur de contrebande, hein? Ayez pas peur, on aura soin de lui. Il joue joliment bien, monsieur, n'est-ce pas? Taffy shook Gecko's hand and asked, Où restez-vous, Gecko? 48 rue des Pousse-Cailloux, au 5e. How strange, said Taffy to his wife. How touching! Why, that's where Trilby used to live. The very number, the very floor. Oui, oui, said Gecko, waking up. C'est l'ancienne mansarde de Trilby. J'y suis depuis 12 ans. J'y suis, j'y reste. And he laughed feebly at his mild little joke. Taffy told the address to the cabman, and gave him 5 francs. Merci, monsieur. C'est de l'autre côté de l'eau, près de la Sorbonne, c'est pas? On vous aura soin du bourgeois, soyez tranquille. Ayez pas peur. 48, on y va. Bonsoir, monsieur et dames. And he clacked his whip and rattled away, singing. V'là mon mari qui regarde, prends garde, ne me chatouille plus. Mr. and Mrs. Wine walked back to the hotel, which was not far. She hung up to his big arm and crept close to him, and shivered a little. It was quite chilly. Their footsteps were very audible in the stillness. Pit, pat, floppity, clop. Otherwise they were both silent. They were tired, yawny, sleepy, and very sad, and each was thinking, and knew the other was thinking, that a week in Paris was just enough, and how nice it would be, in just a few hours more, to hear the rooks cawing round their own quiet little English country home, where 3 jolly boys would soon be coming for the holidays. And there we leave them to their useful, humdrum, happy domestic existence, that which there is no better that I know of, at their time of life, and no better time of life than theirs. Où peut-on être mieux qu'au sein de sa famille? That blessed harbour of refuge well within our reach, and having really cut our wisdom teeth at last, and learned the ropes, and left off hankering after the moon, we can do with so little down here. A little work, a little play, to keep us going, and so good day. A little warmth, a little light, of love's bestowing, and so good night. A little fun, to match the sorrow of each day's growing, and so good morrow. A little trust, that when we die, we reap our sowing, and so good-bye. End of Part 8, and of Trilby by Georges du Maurier. Recording by J.C. Guan, Montreal, August 2010.